I stood there in a suit I had borrowed from a neighbor, the sleeves too long and the collar too tight, while my son raised his glass and smiled like a politician. $8,000 a month, he announced to the room of Dallas executives. That is what I give my father so he can live in comfort after all his sacrifices. Applause, laughter, admiring nods, and me frozen. 8,000. I drove a rusting Ford with a broken heater. I ate canned beans for dinner. I scrubbed warehouses at midnight to make rent. Yet here I was, turned into a prop, a lie wrapped in champagne. My son's arm pressed down on my shoulder, but the silence pressing inside me was heavier. At 57, you learn the deepest betrayals do not come from enemies. They come from the child you once carried on your shoulders. And then I saw her, my daughter-in-law, her smile sharp as glass, her eyes sliding toward me with a glint of triumph. Not pride, not warmth, a challenge, as if she knew I would stay silent, as if she was daring me to. But what happened next made every face in that room turn pale. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The truth is, I did not belong in that ballroom. Not with the crystal chandeliers dripping light onto marble floors, not with the smell of money that clung to polished shoes and designer gowns. My hands still carried the scent of bleach from the warehouse I had scrubbed just 2 nights before. The jacket I wore was too tight around my shoulders, as if it wanted to remind me I had no business standing among these titans of business and oil. Richard Bell, that was my name. Once it carried some weight in my small corner of Dallas, back when I still had a steady job, a home that was mine, and a family that looked at me with something close to respect. Now it seemed to me nothing more than a convenient story my son could use to polish his reputation. I looked around the room and saw the faces of men who controlled skyscrapers and oil fields. They raised their glasses to my son Michael, who stood tall in his tailored tuxedo. His voice carried the confidence of a man who had learned to bend numbers and people to his advantage. $8,000 a month. He said it like a badge of honor, like the golden proof that he was a dutiful son. What he gave me was a monthly phone call sometimes and a Christmas sweater wrapped in tissue paper. What he actually gave me was the humiliation of being erased from his world, except when I could serve as a prop in his performance of generosity. Beside him, Sophia tilted her glass of champagne and let her smile spread wider. Her eyes met mine for only a second, but it was long enough to slice something deep inside me. There was no warmth there, no kindness, only a flicker that said she knew I was powerless to contradict him. That woman had polished ambition in her bones. She wore wealth like armor, and I knew instinctively that she had helped script this little charade. I forced my lips into what must have looked like a smile. My heart thudded in my chest, but I said nothing. Because silence was easier than spectacle. Silence meant I could leave with a shred of dignity intact. But the silence was not mine to keep for long. I excused myself from the circle of executives and made my way toward the terrace. My shoes clicked against the polished stone, but the noise of the party swallowed me whole. The December air was cool when I stepped outside. I pulled it deep into my lungs, hoping it would wash away the shame I carried inside. From the terrace, I could see the Dallas skyline blinking in the distance, sharp and cold. 1,000 windows reflecting success, while mine reflected only exhaustion. Behind me, I heard voices. Michael's laugh booming rehearsed. Sophia's delicate tone wrapping itself around the word, darling. Their laughter mixed with the clinking of glasses, a sound that once might have stirred pride in me. Now it only deepened the ache. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a message from the electric company reminding me that the bill was overdue. The number on the screen was smaller than the amount my son claimed he showered on me every month. I leaned on the railing and thought of all the nights I had worked, cleaning warehouses where the air burned my lungs, driving forklifts until my back screamed, watching the numbers in my bank account hover just above zero. I thought of the meals skipped, the rent checks delayed, the small humiliations that had piled up like bricks around me. And then I thought of Michael standing there with his tuxedo shining and his glass raised high, telling a room full of strangers he gave me $8,000 a month. It was not just a lie, it was theft. Because if he was telling them he gave me that money, then it was going somewhere. And it was not to me. Sophia's voice startled me. "Richard," she said softly, "are you all right?" I turned and there she was, silhouetted in the doorway, her designer dress catching the glow from inside. She stepped out with a smile that was all porcelain. "You look pale," Perhaps the champagne is a bit much for you. I shook my head. I do not drink. She tilted her head, studying me like one might study an inconvenient detail in an otherwise perfect painting. Michael worries about you, you know. He always says how generous he is with you. Sometimes I think he gives too much. Too much. The words nearly made me laugh. I have not received a penny, I said carefully. Not a cent of that allowance he talks about. Her eyes flashed for just a moment. Surprise maybe, or calculation. Then she smiled again, smooth and practiced. Oh, Richard, perhaps you forgot. At your age, it is easy to lose track of financial details. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. I may be tired, Sophia, but I am not senile. I balance every dollar because I have to, and I know exactly how much I receive, which is nothing. Her smile thinned and her voice cooled. Well, perhaps Michael has arranged it differently. Some investment accounts, some trusts you do not see directly. He takes care of everything. You should be grateful. Grateful. The word hung between us like poison. She leaned in then, so close I could smell the faint perfume on her neck. Family is everything, Richard. It would be such a shame if anything disrupted that. And then she walked away, her heels clicking against the stone, leaving me with the echo of a threat wrapped in silk. When I returned inside, the party was already shifting into its final act. Guests were finishing desserts and laughter was softening into farewells. Michael caught my eye across the room and smiled at me, a showman's smile that never quite reached his eyes. I collected my coat and left without a word. The drive back to my apartment was long, the streets nearly empty. My Ford rattled against every pothole. The heater coughed weak air, useless against the December chill. I climbed the narrow stairs to my one-bedroom unit and stepped into silence. The walls were thin, the carpet worn, and the smell of cleaning chemicals still clung to my jacket. On the table was a stack of bills neatly arranged in the order I would have to beg time to pay them. Electricity, rent, car insurance, groceries. Each one is heavier than the last. I sat down and stared at them, the humiliation of the evening still burning in my chest. I opened my laptop and logged into my bank account, even though I already knew what I would find. The numbers glowed on the screen, pitifully small. No mysterious deposits, no hidden accounts, no $8,000. The truth was clear. My son had built his reputation on a lie, and I was the body he had draped it over. Sleep did not come easily that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my thoughts turning in endless circles. Memories came back uninvited. Michael, at 5 years old, was sitting on my shoulders at the county fair, laughing as he pointed at the Ferris wheel. Michael, at 18, clutching his college acceptance letter, his eyes full of dreams that I had promised myself I would help him chase. Michael, at 25, was standing in my kitchen asking for money to start his first business. I had given him everything. Every shift, every dollar, every ounce of strength. I had mortgaged my future for his chances. And now at 57, I was left with nothing but bills and a body worn thin while he stood in tuxedos and toasted to lies. I realized something then, something cold and sharp that sliced through the fog of exhaustion. Silence was no longer an option. They thought I would stay quiet because I always had. Because fathers are supposed to swallow their pride for the sake of their children. Because men like me fade into the background while others take the stage. But this time, I would not. The next morning, the alarm rang at 4:30 as it always did. I pulled on my uniform, a polyester vest that made me invisible to every shopper who would walk by me later that day. My body ached, but my mind was alive with something new. I drove through the empty streets to the grocery store where I stocked shelves before dawn. As I cut open boxes of cereal, I found myself rehearsing questions. Where had the money gone? What proof did Michael have? Could it be traced? Janet, a coworker, noticed the tension in my face. Long night, she asked. I smiled faintly. Something like that. Tell me, Janet, if someone claimed they gave you money every month but you never saw it, what would you call that? She frowned. Fraud. Either tax fraud if they are lying to the government, or theft if they are keeping money meant for you. Her words stuck in my head as I worked. Fraud. Theft. Words heavier than betrayal. Words that carried consequences. And I knew in that moment that this was only the beginning. That night I sat again at my small table, a notebook open in front of me. At the top of the page I wrote, Allowance. What really happened. I wrote down every detail I could remember from the party. Every word Michael had said, the look in Sophia's eyes. the exact phrases she had used on the terrace. By the time I set my pen down, the page was filled. The story was no longer just in my head. It was on paper, real, undeniable. I looked at it and felt something stir inside me. Not despair, not confusion. Something colder, something steadier. Resolve. For the first time in years, I felt awake. Michael and Sophia believed they had silenced me, but they had only given me a reason to speak, and when I did, I would make sure their words, their lies turned into the rope that would hang their carefully built world. Because what they did not understand was that I had nothing left to lose. And a man with nothing left to lose is the one you should fear the most. I woke with the taste of bleach still in my throat and the memory of crystal chandeliers floating over my bed like cold suns. The notebook waited on the table where I had left it open to the words I had written in the dark. Allowance. What really happened? I read the line again and felt the same quiet heat that had carried me through the night. The kind of heat that does not shout or swing, only hardens. I made coffee strong and bitter, swallowed it without cream, and decided that today I would stop being the man who stood there and let a lie wear his name. The morning belonged to the grocery store. It always did. Pallets of canned tomatoes. The shrink wrap squeaked when I pulled it. The beep of the scanner each time I logged a case into inventory. Habit does not care if your heart is breaking. It asks for your hands and takes them. I gave them the way I always had and tried to let the rhythm steady me. Slice, lift, stack, breathe. The floor smelled like detergent and citrus. It helped. Janet found me in the cereal aisle and handed me a box cutter I had forgotten on the floor. She looked at me the way women do when they have seen more life than you admit. Kind and sharp at the same time. You seemed miles away, she said. Everything okay? I wanted to lie. I wanted to say I was fine and then ask about her grandkids. The words tangled on my tongue. Janet say a man stands at a party and listens to his own son brag about giving him money every month. Say the man never saw it. Not once. What would you call that? She did not answer right away. Her eyes changed first. It is theft if the money is meant for you and someone else takes it. It is fraud if he tells the world he pays you to make himself look good or to get benefits from it. Sometimes it is both. Why do you ask? I shook my head and carried a box to the shelf. No reason. Thank you. She touched my arm. If you need help sorting something, I used to do books for a small firm. I still know my way around numbers. I nodded and thanked her again. She returned to her aisle. The scanner beeped. The clock did what clocks do. When my shift ended, I did not drive home. I turned toward the public library instead. I liked that place for the same reason I liked Dawn. It carried its own quiet. The librarian smiled when I walked in. She had helped me once when I could not remember how to print a form. I took a seat in the corner where the light fell softly and opened a browser. Elder financial abuse in Texas. Dependent support documentation. Claiming a parent without paying support. The words that came back were heavy with law. Some were difficult. All of them were clear in the way water is clear when it is very cold. If a person claims a parent as a dependent, they must provide more than half the support. If they document support that never reached the parent, that is fraud. If the parent is an older adult, the law may call it abuse. There were numbers to call. There were guides about evidence, bank records, letters, witnesses. I wrote it all down. Support with no transfer. Paper that says one thing, but money that does another. Document everything. At a table nearby, a young mother read to a child about a bear who could not sleep. Her voice rose and fell like a small wave. I thought about Michael when he was little. The way he had pressed his head against my neck and asked me if bears were real. The memory hit me sideways. I breathed through it. When I stepped outside, the air felt cooler, as if the morning had rolled over and given the day a new face. I sat in my car and stared at the steering wheel until the plan that had been forming inside me clicked into place. There were things I did not know. There were places where those answers lived. One of those places was the house where my son slept on linen sheets and my daughter-in-law counted every dollar that entered and left. I knew Sophia had a yoga class on Tuesdays. I did not know how I knew that. Maybe I had heard her mention it to a friend. Maybe it had been in the background of a holiday conversation. Wealth is loud but routine whispers. I checked the clock and waited until the time matched my guess. Then I drove to their neighborhood where the trees were old and the hedges were shaped like patience. The gate swung open when I pressed the button. Maria opened the door before I could knock. She had worked for them for years, small, precise, and kind in a way that never drew attention to itself. "Mr. Bell," she said, surprised. "Is everything all right?" I made my face worried instead of angry. "I am concerned about Michael," I said. "He seemed tired last night. He did not answer my call this morning. I thought maybe I could sit in his office for a bit, see him if he came home between meetings, just to speak with him. A father worries." Maria looked uncertain. "Mrs. Sophia is in her class until 11. Mr. Michael is at the office downtown. But if you would like to wait in his office, I will bring you tea." I thanked her and followed her down the hall. Michael's office smelled like leather and pride. Dark shelves, heavy desk, a chair that looked like a throne 3 times removed. Papers lay where someone had left them in a hurry. A checkbook sat open near a stack of mail. Maria placed a cup beside it. "If you need anything, call me," she said and closed the door. I stood still and listened. The quiet in that room was different from the quiet of the library. This one had teeth. It waited to see who I was going to be. I took out my phone and set it on the corner of the desk where the microphone could hear if it had to. Then I began to look. Not fast, not messy, respectful even now because I am still a father and this was still my son's home. The checkbook told a story the party had not told. Every month a check for $8,000. The name on the line was not mine. It read S. Torres, Sophia's maiden name before she took Michael's. Besides, other checks in smaller amounts were made out to something called ST Holdings. The dates made a neat ladder back through time. The numbers were too clean. I took photos of each page with my phone. I did not shake. I thought I would. Instead, a strange calm washed over me, the kind that visits when a thing you feared becomes a thing you can touch. In a manila folder labeled taxes sat a letter from an accountant. The letter mentioned dependent support for the father. It spoke of record keeping. It praised Michael for providing $84,000 a year. It suggested a trust called RB Care to simplify things. RB for Richard Bell. The trust did not exist. If it had, I would have known. My name is a thing I would have recognized even in sleep. There was also a spreadsheet, H. Bell support payments, a ledger of months and figures and notes. Some said paid via trust, others said consolidated. None of them said deposited to Richard. I photographed all of it. I put each paper back in the stack like a card in a deck. My phone buzzed. A message from Maria. "Mrs. Sophia just called. She is coming home earlier than planned. 5 minutes." I eased the folder shut and wiped a smudge my finger had left on the desk. Then I sat by the window with the tea in my hands and tried to look like a father who worried about his son and not a man who had walked into a room and found proof that the story everyone had clapped for was a lie that took food from his mouth. Michael arrived first. He moved quickly the way men do when they are trying to get ahead of bad news. "Dad," he said, and he did look concerned. "Are you all right? Maria said you were here." Maria said you were... I stood and hugged him. He smelled like cologne and asphalt and something I could not name. "I am fine," I said. "I could not reach you earlier. I imagined hospital rooms and broken bones and decided I did not like those pictures." He smiled a little. "My phone was on silent in a meeting. Sorry. Everything okay? Do you need anything?" I looked at my son. I wanted to ask him why my name was in a folder about taxes when my bank account carried numbers that would make a college student blush. I wanted to show him the photos and say, "Explain this to me like I am your father and not your problem." I did not. My mouth formed a different sentence. "Are you happy, Michael?" He blinked. "That is a strange question. Maybe. But answer it anyway." He sat in the big leather chair and looked past me at the lawn. "I do not know. There is always more to do, always something to chase. The business, the investments, expectations." He glanced at the doorway as if listening for footsteps. "Sophia expects a lot." That last line sat between us and made a small sound. I nodded and felt a sadness that did not cancel my anger. "You can tell me things," I said. "I am still your father. That means I can hold whatever you hand me." He looked relieved for a second. Then the front door opened and Sophia's voice drifted down the hall. She entered with the kind of smile that photographs well. "Richard, What a surprise. Are you feeling all right? I stood. I was worried about Michael, I said. I wanted to check on him. She slid behind his chair and placed her hands on his shoulders. He did not lean into them. He looked like a man waiting for a dentist to stop drilling. We are fine, she said. Everything is under control. Michael has arranged your finances very carefully. You do not need to trouble yourself with the details. I kept my face still. Details have a way of becoming important, especially the kind that decides whether I can pay rent. Her eyes cooled. You should rest, Richard. Trust the people who love you. The sentence sounded like a lullaby and a lock. I nodded slowly. Thank you for the tea, I said to no one in particular. I should be going. Michael walked me to the door. He squeezed my shoulder the way he had at the party. Call me if you need anything, he said. The sentence was a plank he wanted to place over a hole in the floor. I stepped outside into a yard trimmed so perfectly it looked like it had never known weather. Maria caught my eye from the hall and gave me a quick, worried look. I thanked her with a small nod and walked to my car. I did not drive home. I parked 3 blocks away under a tree that had lost all its leaves and listened to the quiet. Then I called a number I had not dialed in years. Patrick Lowe answered on the 3rd ring. We had worked on the same job site when we were young. He had become a lawyer because he was good with words and not afraid to sit in rooms where power spoke loudly. Richard Bell, he said, was surprised. I thought of you the other day when I drove past the old warehouse. How are you? I stared past my windshield at a lawn that glowed like money. I need help, I said. Not the kind that can wait. He heard something in my voice. Where are you? We met at a coffee shop that smelled like almonds and a kind of time I no longer lived in. Patrick had lines in his face I had not seen before, but his eyes were the same. He listened while I told him about the party and the allowance and the words Sophia had used on the terrace. I showed him the photos. He scrolled through them slowly, and then again slower. You will not like what I'm going to say, he said finally, but you already know it. This is fraud. If you are over a certain age, it counts as abuse in many places. Even if you were not, the filing strategies here are enough to interest people who wear badges. You need to protect yourself. We will document everything and get ready to move. Not today. Soon. We want more than a story. We want a pattern. What should I do first? Write everything you remember. Names, dates, exact words. Keep every bill. Make copies of your bank statements. Do not confront them in a way that gives them time to burn paper. And Richard. Yes. You will want to make this about your son because he is your son. But there is another person in this picture who has been moving pieces on the board. Do not underestimate her. I did not tell him about the way Sophia had looked at me with triumph in her eyes as if she had already written the ending. He must have seen something in my face because he nodded. I will send you the name of an accountant I trust. Quiet man, strong with numbers. We will trace anything that can be traced. When I left Patrick, my legs felt steadier. He had given me a plan, and plans are ladders you can climb even in the dark. I drove to my apartment and spread my bills on the table again. I stacked them by due date and whispered the dates under my breath like a prayer. Then I pulled out my notebook and started to write. Not the kind of writing that makes a person into a hero, the kind that agrees to be exact. December party, 8,000. My son raised his glass. Sophia spoke about gratitude. Tea in the office. Check to S. Torres. ST Holdings. Accountant letter. H. Bell spreadsheet. RB Care Trust does not exist. The words steadied me. They drew lines around the shape of the thing I was fighting. When I finished, I called Janet and asked if she would look at some numbers with me. She said yes before I could explain. The next day, we sat in the break room at the store with a bundle of statements and a cheap calculator that rattled when she pressed the keys. She wore reading glasses with red frames. I watched her eyes move as she read. After a while, she pushed the papers toward me. These show someone living on almost nothing, she said. If anyone claims they give you $84,000 a year, I do not see it. If I had to guess, the money is being routed anywhere but here. Can it be followed? If we had access to their accounts, yes. Without that, we need leaks. People talk when they think no one is listening. People also leave paper trails when they believe no one will ever look. You should think about who might care enough to tell the truth. A house manager, an assistant, someone whose job depends on noticing things that rich people do not. I thanked her and brought her coffee to show her I meant it. She smiled and patted my hand. I went back to work with a head that felt full and clear. At dusk, the warehouse called my name again. The industrial lights hummed overhead. The mop bucket sloshed as I pushed it along the corridor. I had been cleaning that building for months. I knew the habits of the tenants. The 7th floor contained a firm whose brochure I had seen in a waiting room once. Elder Law and Advocacy. The name on the glass door said Blackwood. I emptied their trash and thought about knocking on their door in the morning as a client instead of a janitor. The idea felt bold and dangerous in a way that made me smile. On my way home, I stopped at a pay-as-you-go phone store and bought a small recorder that fit in my pocket and looked like a key fob. Texas is a place where one person can record a conversation without telling the other. I had learned that at the library. I wanted to remember exactly how my son spoke to me when I asked for the truth, not because I expected him to confess, because I wanted to hold his words up to the light later and see what they revealed. At home, I cooked rice and eggs and ate them out of the pan to save a plate. I sat by the window and watched the parking lot fill with people returning from shifts that ended when the city pretended to sleep. A couple argued softly near their car and then made up their heads leaning together. A man in a wheelchair smoked and laughed into his phone. Life happened in small apartments the way it did in mansions. The difference sat in the bank. I dialed Michael and let the call ring. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice flat. "Dad, I am in the middle of something. Can we talk later?" I pressed the recorder button with my thumb. I heard it click only because I knew to listen. "I will be quick," I said. "At the party you said you give me $8,000 a month. I have never received it. Where does it go?" Silence. Then a breath. "Dad, finances are complicated. I set things up to help you long term. You may not understand the structure, but it is in your best interest." "What structure?" A pause. "Trusts, consolidation, investments. The words you do not need to worry about, you are taken care of." "That is interesting," I said quietly, "because I am not taken care of. I am counting quarters for laundry. If there is a trust with my name on it, I would like to see it. If there are payments listed under my name, I would like to know who cashes them." His voice hardened. "You sound ungrateful. After everything I have done, you are going to accuse me." "I am not accusing. I am asking where the money is. You are getting agitated. Maybe you should talk to someone about memory or confusion. It happens at your age." The sentence landed like a slap. I swallowed. My mind is clear. My bank account is empty. If you are telling people you support me, then support me. Or stop saying it. He exhaled like a man who did not like the room he was in. "We will discuss this later. In private. Not on the phone. Do not bring this up with anyone." The line went dead. I held the phone to my ear anyway, as if the warmth of it could melt something that had frozen in me. I set it down and replayed the recording. The words were there. The tone I knew too well. The mixture of pity and threat. I saved the file in 3 places and named it in a way that would make sense at 3 in the morning when the mind is not kind. Sleep came in pieces. When it finally stayed, it brought a dream where I stood at the edge of a lake whose surface looked like glass. Underneath, I could see letters move like fish. Fraud, abuse, pride. A hand touched my shoulder, and when I turned, it was a younger version of myself. He looked at me with disappointment and then with something softer. "It took you long enough," he said. We laughed like men who remember how. The next morning, I called the office on the 7th floor. A receptionist answered. "Blackwood Elder Law," she said. I told her my name and said I had a concern. I said I was not sure if it was legal or family. She said those were often the same. She scheduled an appointment for 2 days later. I spent the time between then and now making a list of possible allies. Janet. The librarian who could point me to records. Patrick. Maybe even Maria if she was willing to speak. I rehearsed what I would say to each. I practiced keeping my voice calm, even when I wanted to shout. Calm is a bridge. Rage is a storm. Storms do not always move a man from one side to the other. On the day of the appointment, I wore the same suit I had worn to the party, the sleeves still too long because that is what I had. The receptionist led me to an office that smelled like paper and plants. The woman behind the desk introduced herself as Patricia. She had the steady face of someone who has heard stories that would break a softer listener. "Tell me what happened," she said. I told her. I did not try to make it pretty. I did not make myself noble. I said I had been a father who gave too much and asked too little. I said my son had learned to use that. I placed the photos on her desk and slid the recorder toward her. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she folded her hands and looked at me the way a builder looks at a wall before he begins. "This is strong," she said. "Not because of one thing, but because of the shape the pieces make together. The checks to Sophia under her maiden name, the accountant's letter, the spreadsheet that mislabels transfers, the absence of deposits to you, the recorded call where your son tries to dismiss you as confused. If we want to push, we can. We will do it wisely. That means we will gather more. We will not give them time to destroy what we need." "Can you keep going?" "I can," I said. "I have been doing harder things for fewer reasons." She smiled. "Good. Begin with copies of everything you have. Keep a log of every call. If you can get someone inside the house to testify about the checks, even better. I will prepare letters. If we need to move suddenly, we will be ready." When I stepped back into the afternoon, the sun felt different. Warmer, though the temperature had not changed. People moved past me on the sidewalk carrying cups and briefcases and small joys I could not see. I climbed into my Ford and turned the key. The engine coughed. I patted the dashboard like an old friend. On the way home, I stopped at a secondhand store and bought a jacket that fit a little better. The cashier told me it looked sharp. I told her thank you and meant it. In the parking lot, I sat for a moment and let myself feel something I had not allowed in a while. Pride. Not the kind that brags in ballrooms. The kind that sits with a man and says, "You did not let them turn you into a ghost." Back in my apartment, I opened the notebook again. I added new lines. Library research. Call with Michael recorded. Appointment with Patricia. Proof plan. Underneath, I wrote a sentence that had carried me through long nights on wet floors. Keep going. I washed my hands and watched the water run gray and then clear. I made a sandwich and ate it while the late afternoon slid toward evening. The phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. The words were short. "We need to talk. Stop posting lies." It did not include a name. It did not have to. I did not answer. I turned the phone face down and listened to the quiet. I thought about the terrace and the way Sophia had leaned in and told me to be grateful. I thought about Michael's hand on my shoulder and the weight of it. I thought about Maria and the quick worry in her eyes. I thought about Janet with her red glasses and the way she had said leaks. People talk when they think no one is listening. The next morning, I drove back to that neighborhood with the shaped hedges. I did not go to the front door. I waited around the corner and watched for the car I knew Sophia drove to her class. When it passed, I counted to 200 and walked to the gate. It opened. Maria met me halfway down the hall, her face pale. "Mr. Bell," she whispered, "you should not be here." She looked over her shoulder. Then she lowered her voice even more. "There are checks. I have seen them. The name is not yours. I did not want to get involved, but what they are doing is not right. If someone asks me, I will tell the truth." I felt something like relief break open in my chest. "I will not ask you to risk your job," I said. "If there is a way to protect you, Patricia will find it. For now, please take care." She nodded and pressed a folded paper into my hand. It was a copy of an envelope. The name on the front read ST Holdings. The return address was Michael's office. I left the house and walked back to my car under the bright winter sun. My hands shook then finally when no one could see. Not from fear, from the raw feeling that comes when a person who has been told he is invisible sees what happens when he decides to be seen. I drove to a small park and sat on a bench near a pond where ducks left lines on the surface like handwriting. I thought about what would come next. There would be noise. There would be denial. There would be attempts to make me small again, to turn me into the story my son needed rather than the person I was. I put my hand on the recorder in my pocket like a man touches a talisman. The plastic felt warm from my body heat. I imagined the next conversation with Michael. I imagined the way he would say words like structure and care. I imagined myself saying the words I had not said yet. "I know. I have proof. Stop." The light shifted. The ducks made their way to the other side. I stood and walked back to the car. On the way, I passed a set of wind chimes hanging from a porch that looked like it had belonged to someone's grandmother for 30 years. The chimes rang when the wind moved and then stilled when it did not. I listened for a long moment and then kept going. Night fell softly. I cooked pasta and added a can of tomatoes. I ate slowly and let my body know the food was for more than fuel. Then I sat at the table with the notebook and wrote the last thing a man needs to write to himself when he stands at the edge of a fight he did not choose. I wrote it once and then again. We are not done. The paper Maria had pressed into my palm still carried the warmth of her hand when I unfolded it again at my kitchen table. The copy was faint, like a ghost of a thing someone tried to hide. ST Holdings. My son's office address is the return, not my name anywhere. I set the paper flat and placed my palm over it as if I could feel the shape of what it meant through my skin. I sat still and listened to the old refrigerator hum and the upstairs neighbor move a chair across the floor. Small sounds built a room around me. The paper beneath my hand built something else, a bridge between a public lie and a private trail of numbers that had never found their way to me. I boiled water for coffee and watched the kettle breathe a thin line of steam. The night before had ended with 3 words in my notebook: we are not done. This morning began with the same 3 words. They sounded different on my tongue now, less like a promise, more like a plan. I called Patricia and told her about the envelope. She told me to bring it to her office after lunch. She spoke in the steady way a person speaks when they know storms and trust boats. Before the call ended, she said one more thing. Do not carry this alone. This kind of truth is heavy, and it likes to tip people over when they hold it by themselves. I thanked her and hung up. There was time before lunch, and I did not want to sit with my thoughts and watch them circle the room like birds without windows to fly through. I needed movement. I needed a new line to follow. The library opened at 9. I arrived 10 minutes early and waited with 2 students and a man reading a newspaper that he had folded into a neat square. When the doors slid open, we moved in quietly the way people do when they enter a place they respect. The librarian recognized me and nodded. I took my usual corner and began to search. ST Holdings Dallas, public business records, property records. The city database asked me questions, and I answered them with the patience of a man who has learned to wait for trucks to unload. After a while, a list appeared. An entity called ST Holdings had purchased a downtown condo 8 months after Michael married Sophia. Cash purchase. No lien. There was a unit number. There was a date. There was a price that made me sit still and place my hand on the table. I printed the page and read it again as the paper slid warm into my fingers. I searched the entity more and found a mailing address that matched the office building my son owned. The same building I had once changed light bulbs in when I did odd jobs for the company that held the janitorial contract. The circle tightened in my chest in a way that was not panic. It was recognition. Familiar shapes in a new light. I called Patrick and told him what I had found. He told me to keep copies and bring them to Patricia. He said this was the kind of thread that pulls more threads loose. Then he asked how I was. It took me a moment to answer. Tired, I said. Clear too. That is a strange combination. He laughed softly and said it was the best combination for the kind of work we were about to do. On my way to Patricia's, I drove past the downtown tower that held the unit on the printout. The glass skin of the building shone like a blade. A doorman stood at the entrance with his hands folded the way men do when they have learned to stand still for a living. I watched a woman step out of a car and disappear through revolving doors. I watched a man come out with a dog whose collar gleamed. I did not go in. I only needed to see it with my eyes to make the information feel true in my bones. Then I drove to Patricia's office. Her assistant led me to a room with a window that looked over a street lined with trees that had forgotten it was winter. Patricia joined me with a legal pad and a pen. I handed her the envelope copy and the printout of the condo and the notes I had made in the margin. She read them and then read them again the way people read recipes when they are about to cook for someone they care about. Her pen moved. Names, dates, arrows linking one thing to another. When she looked up, her eyes were bright in a way I had not seen before. This is not just a family lie, she said. It is a system. Money claimed as support is not going to you. Checks to a shell that feeds property. A paper trail that says one thing and a bank trail that says another. If we can get an affidavit from someone inside the house about those checks, we have more than a story. If we can find an accountant who will speak about the letter you found, we have weight." "Maria," I said. "She is afraid, but she is good. She wants to do the right thing." Patricia nodded. "We will protect her as best we can. I will draft a statement for her to review that focuses on what she saw and not on what she thinks. Facts are the backbone here. Emotion will come later, and it will come from the right mouths. Through all of this, I need you to do one thing. Keep your voice steady. The court and the world read steadiness as truth." I told her about the call with Michael and let her listen to the recording. Her mouth tightened when she heard him suggest memory problems. She wrote a note and slid the pad across to me. "This is a pattern," the note said in a firm hand. "It is not new." Her finger tapped the pad softly. Courts understand patterns. Before I left, she placed a folder in front of me. Inside was a list of state resources, a pamphlet about elder financial abuse, and a few blank log sheets. "Document every contact," she said. "Date, time, what was said. The paper shield matters. It matters more than most people think." I thanked her and placed the folder in my bag as if it were a passport. Outside, the afternoon had turned thin and bright. I drove to the grocery store for my evening shift and waved at Janet through the glass. She met me at the back near the loading dock, where the air smelled like cardboard and diesel and sugar from a pallet of soda that had split a week earlier. I showed her the printout of the condo purchase. She whistled under her breath and shook her head. "Cash," she said. "That is a lot of beans and warehouse floors." We worked side by side for a while without speaking the way people do when they are thinking about something that matters and waiting for the right sentence to come. She was the first to find one. "If you want to push this beyond the house and the office, you need air. By air, I mean eyes, the kind that do not live in their world. You need the story to breathe outside the rooms they control." I knew what she meant. The thought had been a small flame in the back of my mind for days. I feared it because flames burn, and because stories in public take on lives of their own. But I also knew the lie had been told in public first, on a ballroom floor under crystal light. If I wanted to unwind it to the root, maybe I needed to put the truth in the same air. I went home after the shift and made a pot of noodles and ate standing at the counter. Then I opened my laptop and stared at the blank screen. I typed a title and deleted it. I typed another and deleted it too. Finally, I wrote words that felt right because they were simple. The dependent father. Then I began to write as if I were talking to one person who loved me enough to listen all the way through. I wrote about the party in simple sentences. No dressing, no secondhand metaphors. I wrote about the car with the broken heater and the cans stacked in my cupboard and the warehouse floors with their wet gloss. I wrote that my son told a room full of men he gave me $8,000 a month and that my bank account told me otherwise. I wrote about the terrace and Sophia's voice and her soft threat wrapped in silk. I did not name them. I did not need to. The truth did not require their names to be heavy. I ended with a question. If your child says he gives you money and your life says he does not, who do you believe? And if the world claps for him while you count coins for laundry, what do you do next? I read it aloud the way a person reads a letter they are about to mail and cannot take back. The words felt like mine even once they left my mouth. I created a new account on a platform I had not used before and posted the letter. Then I closed the laptop and sat in the dark with my hands around a mug that had gone cold. I did not expect much. Most things a man like me does in the night stay there. In the morning there were messages, dozens, then hundreds. Strangers wrote to say they had stood in rooms where someone else held the mic and spoke their life like a lie. Older men and women wrote to say they had been claimed as dependents without receiving a dime. Some stories were small in dollars and large in hurt. Some were large in both. I read until my eyes burned and my chest ached. I replied to a few, then more. Thank you, I see you, I believe you. Those words have a weight that money cannot match. By noon, a local page that thrives on stories of the city had shared the post. By evening, a reporter had sent a polite note asking if I would speak on background. I did not answer. Not yet. I had to move slower than the internet. The internet runs. I needed to place my feet on each step and feel the wood hold. The phone rang near 5. Michael. My thumb hovered and then pressed. Dad, he said, his voice tight. Have you been posting nonsense online? People are sending me links. They are connecting dots that look a lot like us. You are making a mess because you do not understand how these things work. I pressed the recorder in my pocket with my other thumb. What things I said. Financial arrangements, tax efficiency, privacy, words like that. I do not understand tax efficiency. I understand rent. I understand food. I understand bullshit when it sits down at my table and asks to be thanked for being there. He sighed hard. You do not know what you are doing. You are going to embarrass yourself and damage my business. You will embarrass me and Sophia. I let the silence stretch until I could feel his nervous breath pushing through the line. I will not be embarrassed for telling the truth about my life, I said. If your business and your wife depend on a lie about me, that is your problem, not mine. He lowered his voice. If you keep this up, I will have to talk to someone about your capacity. It would be better to handle this quietly, for everyone. Capacity. The word hung there, not memory now. Capacity. I pictured a paper with a signature that said I was not fit to decide whether to boil water or step outside. I felt a heat rise in me that was not anger. It was something cleaner. I am entirely capable, I said, and I am done being your cover. I ended the call. My hands shook a little now, not from fear, from the sudden rush of being done with a certain kind of begging. I saved the recording and wrote the time and the words he had used in the log Patricia gave me. Then I put on my coat and went outside and walked the block to let the air strip the noise from my head. A woman passing by carrying a bag of oranges looked up and said she had read my post. She did not know me. She did not need to. She said her sister had gone through something similar with their mother. She said she hoped I would keep writing. Her voice was kind. Kindness in a stranger's mouth fed me better than pasta. The next day, Patricia called. Your post is moving, she said. It is also useful. People care when they can see a face that is not just a case. We will not rush this. We will use the attention to bring forward others who have seen the checks and letters. Are you ready for that? I told her I was as ready as a man can be when he has lived a long time on the page of someone else's book and is learning to write in his own ink again. We met later that afternoon with Patrick in the room. The three of us sat with copies of the printouts in the envelope and the spreadsheet photos and the notes from my log. Patricia had marked them with small tabs that made a neat row of color down the paper's edge. It looked like a child's toy and a weapon at the same time. She outlined a plan in a voice that made each step feel like a stair and not a cliff. We would gather a signed statement from Maria about the checks she had seen. We would identify the accountant from the letter and request confirmation that these were the documents he had prepared. We would prepare a preservation notice to the office and the bank to warn them not to destroy records. We would not file until we had enough to make the picture complete. When we did, we would submit to the district attorney and to the tax authorities on the same day. We would not give anyone time to close doors quietly. Patrick looked at me. You should also prepare yourself for the next move from Michael and Sophia. They will attempt to isolate you. They will try to turn people around you against you. They may suggest guardianship. They may call in favors to discredit you. The best answer for all of that is the same. Keep everything you can on paper and in files you share with us. Tell the truth. Do not argue on the phone in ways that make you sound like the person they want you to be. I thought of my son as a boy tracing roads in the dirt with a stick. I thought of him now, a man drawing lines across lives with wire transfers and phrases that sounded kind and cut to the bone. I did not know where the kindness had gone. Maybe it had been small to begin with. Maybe it had been large and got swallowed by a hunger I had helped feed. The thought hurt in a way that did not lessen the need to act. We ended the meeting with a list and a handshake that felt like work beginning. On my way out, I stopped in the lobby to read a poster about a clinic for seniors who needed help with housing. Faces on the poster smiled with a kind of relief I recognized. I wondered how many of them were standing where I was on the edge of something that could put their life back into their own hands. At home that evening, I cooked lentils and onions and ate them slowly. Then I opened the laptop to find the post had been shared by 2 small stations that cover human stories in quiet voices. I read comments from people in cities I would never visit. A man in Ohio wrote about a paycheck he had lent to his son that never came back and how that loan had turned into a story his family told about his generosity instead of a hole in his bank account. A woman in Arizona wrote that her daughter-in-law handled all the bills, and somehow there was never enough left for groceries, but always enough for spa days. I wrote back to as many as I could. I told them to keep receipts. I told them to log calls. I told them their voice mattered even if it shook. Near midnight, the apartment settled into its sounds. Someone upstairs laughed. A bus sighed on the street and moved on. I closed the laptop and was about to turn off the lamp when the phone lit up again. Unknown number. I nearly let it go to voicemail, then answered. The voice on the line was low and careful. "Mr. Bell," the man said. "My name is Alan. I used to work for your son. I think I have something you need to see." I sat up straighter. I asked him to tell me more. He said he did not want to speak on the phone. He sounded tired in a way that made me trust him more than if he had sounded sure. We agreed to meet in a coffee shop near a bus stop where no one would look twice at either of us. I wrote the time in the log and slept with my clothes laid out on the chair at the foot of my bed. The morning held a thin rain that did not bother with thunder. I walked to the shop with my hood up and my breath visible. Alan was early. He was younger than I had expected and carried a folder that looked too heavy for its size. He ordered tea and I ordered black coffee, and we sat at a table near the window. He had been a junior accountant at Michael's firm. He had left 2 months earlier after being asked to move numbers in a way that made his training hurt. He said he had kept copies of emails that mentioned a trust with my initials and instructions for how to label transfers to make them look like support. He slid the folder across. The top page was an email from a senior manager to my son. It referenced dependent support alignment and mentioned ST Holdings in a parenthetical that I could not unsee once I had seen it. Another email contained a list of payments labeled H Support, routed through an internal account that had no connection to me. My name was in these documents the way paint is in a room someone intends to sell. It made everything look warmer without warming anything. I asked Alan why he had reached out. He looked at his cup. "I have a grandmother," he said. "She is the reason I went into accounting. She cleaned houses for years and counted tips on a small kitchen table like it was church. If someone did to her what I think your son and his wife are doing to you, I would want someone to help her." He glanced up and then looked back down. "Also, I need to sleep. I have not been sleeping." We sat in the quiet that follows a person telling you who they really are. I told him I understood. I told him I would keep his name safe as long as I could. I left with the folder under my coat held close to my chest, not because I feared the rain, but because I was carrying something that could change the way my son told the story of himself to a world that had clapped at his words and not looked at his mother's hands. I took the folder straight to Patricia. She read fast and then slow. She looked like a person who had been handed a key to a room she knew existed but had not yet seen. She made copies and placed the originals in a sleeve that sealed with a sound that satisfied me. Then she smiled at me in a way that felt like the first warm day of early spring. "We are moving," she said. "They will feel it." When I stepped outside, the rain had stopped. The air smelled washed. I stood on the sidewalk and closed my eyes for a moment. People passed around me with bags and phones and plans. A bus sighed again and then went quiet. Somewhere a church bell rang the hour. On my way home, I drove past the country club where the lie had been born in public. The gate stood open for a delivery truck. I slowed and looked through the iron at the lawn and the lights in the room where my son had held a glass to the light and told the world a story that made him shine. I did not feel rage as I expected. I felt something steadier and more useful. I felt ready. Back in my apartment, I opened the notebook and wrote the day's story in the log. Maria, Patricia, Janet, the condo, Alan with the folder and the tired eyes, the coffee shop with fogged glass, the emails that said more than men in suits would ever say into a microphone. Then I flipped to a clean page and wrote another sentence. The sentence lifted itself and settled in my chest like a good weight. Tomorrow, we turn the lock. I set the pen down and walked to the window. The sky over the city had turned the color of steel that has learned sunshine. I thought of the boy I had carried on my shoulders and the man he had become. I thought of the way love can be blind and how it should not keep a person from seeing. I thought of all the people who had written to me and told me they too were tired of being wrapped in someone else's story. I whispered the 3 words that began my day. We are not done. Then I turned off the lamp and let the room go dark around me. The quiet did not feel empty anymore. It felt full of people breathing and moving in the same direction. It felt like a hallway where light waits at the end. It felt like a place you go when you are ready to be seen. The envelope lay on my kitchen table like a small shadow. Someone had pushed it under my door before dawn. no name on the front. Inside was a printout of my post with a thick line drawn through the first 5 lines and a note written in heavy strokes of marker. Stop. Do not shame the family. The ink smelled like solvent. The letters looked rushed, the kind a hand makes when it wants to deliver a blow and run. I held the paper flat with my palm and let the refrigerator hum fill the room until the sound steadied my breath. I brewed coffee strong and black and swallowed the first mouthful without tasting it. Then I opened my notebook. I wrote the hour and what I had found. Anonymous envelope. Threat implied. Tone coercive. I wrote that I would save the paper in a sleeve and that it belonged to the same story as the checks and the letter and the emails. The small lines on the page felt like stakes in the ground. I needed a straight path. The path began in ink. My phone vibrated on the table. Patricia. I told her about the envelope and the smell of the ink. She asked me to seal it inside a clear protector if I had one, and to bring it to her office later in the day. She said we would treat it as a sample of pressure in the file. Then her voice shifted the way a voice does when news rests behind it. The accountant on the inside had delivered an internal transfer list to a safe address. Alan had not been guessing. He had been cutting a wire the right way. What do we do next? I asked. We filed preservation notices to the bank and to Michael's office this afternoon, she said. We scheduled Maria to sign a statement. And one more thing. If Michael calls to invite you somewhere, accept. Speak calmly. Do not argue. Your job is to bring stillness home to us and to hold what is said. I thanked her and ended the call. The envelope slid into a plastic sleeve with a pleasing whisper. I placed it beside the condo printout and the copies of the emails Alan had handed me. The weight of the folder had changed in the past few days. Not heavy like a burden. Heavy like a good tool. I stood put on my jacket and walked out into the cold hallway with the folder close to my ribs. The wind pressed against the car as I pulled into the lot outside Patricia's building. Upstairs, her office held winter light like a bowl holds water. She photographed the envelope and tucked it into a labeled sleeve. She showed me 2 letters prepared on her desk. One addressed to the bank requesting that all transactions related to my name or any structure claiming support on my behalf be preserved. One addressed to Michael's company instructing them not to destroy records. I read the letters slowly. I signed where she indicated. The signatures looked like the same hand I had used to sign school forms and mechanic receipts and an old mortgage. That felt right. This was a continuation, not an invention. Before I left, Patricia added a note that made me smile despite myself. Let the phone ring one more beat before you answer when he calls, she said. That small pause makes people reveal things they meant to hide. I told her I would try to gift him that silence. My next meeting had been arranged with care. A quiet church on the south side where foot traffic remained a rumor on weekdays. Maria waited in a pew, hands folded like a student in a class that mattered. When she stood, she started to say sorry and sat again as if the word did not belong to her. I sat beside her and placed the folder between us. She whispered that she did not want to lose her job. She added that she could not keep her mouth closed forever. I told her I would not allow this to cost her wages if there was any way to prevent it. I told her we would take each step with care. Patricia had prepared a simple statement. Maria read each sentence with her lips moving. She described the 8,000 checks drawn monthly to S. Torres. She described Sophia directing repairs and invoices through ST Holdings. She described the afternoon I had sat in Michael's office and the text she sent warning me that Sophia was near. The pen trembled when she signed. I placed one hand on the paper to keep it flat. She lifted her eyes and let out a long breath as if a stone had been set on the ground after being carried too far. I said thank you. I said her daughter would be proud of her. Her eyes shone and then steadied the way eyes do when a woman has weathered more seasons than people realize. I left through the side entrance and crossed the small courtyard. The sun slid under the edge of a cloud and turned the stained glass window into a square of heat. I knew what I wanted to do next. Go stand in the lobby of the glass tower whose name sat on the page in my folder. Not to cause a scene, to listen with my eyes. Sometimes truth prefers a bright room. Sometimes it enters by itself if you hold the door. The lobby smelled like cleanser and soft money. The floor shone and made every footstep careful. The receptionist smiled and asked how she could help me. I asked about rentals as if I were a man counting how many windows could fit in his future. She said they had owner-occupied units and units managed by companies. I asked whether a group called ST Holdings held any that were available. She checked a screen and nodded. One had recently gone vacant. She quoted a number that rose inside my head and set itself beside the memory of my pantry. She printed a flyer and slid it toward me. I placed it in the folder opposite the statement Maria had signed. Pieces traveling toward one another. As I turned back onto my street later that day, the phone buzzed. Michael. I let it ring long enough for that small breath Patricia had described to appear between us. Then I answered. His voice had softness laid over steel. He told me he had heard I had been asking questions in places meant for discretion. He said if I needed anything, I should call him first. He said walking around with questions could make things harder for everyone. He said all of this slowly buying time to prepare the next thing he would say. I told him I had seen papers. I told him I wanted to know where $8,000 a month had gone. I told him if there was an account in my name, I wanted to feel its paper in my hands. He paused long enough to imagine a new story. Then he said these matters were complicated. He said he had arranged ways to secure my life. He said we should speak at the club in a civilized setting. Tomorrow afternoon. I said yes. I reminded him that I admired simple things. He did not laugh. He ended the call after the smallest silence. I wrote the time and place in the notebook. The sentence looked like a stake as well. Sometimes even a meeting can hold a piece of truth if you tie it to the right post. The next morning the club smelled of old wealth and lemon polish. Michael sat with a smile that looked taped in place. I set the folder beside my chair and thanked the server for the water. I began slowly. I told him I needed a thing with a name. Truth. From his mouth. Not from letters that could be argued. Not from a checkbook written to another name. He tapped his spoon against porcelain and told me he loved me. He told me he had done everything for the family. He told me there were structures and vehicles and arrangements and that a trust had been created to secure me. I asked for the name. He said RB Care without blinking. I kept my face careful. I asked why a beneficiary would not receive statements. He said perhaps a clerk had misfiled an envelope. He would check. He would send. The promises slid across the table like coasters. None held a glass. I did not push. I changed shape. I asked if he was happy. He looked at his hands as if answers lived there. He said happiness was a responsibility. He said it was a shape made of expectations. He said Sophia believed in big wins, and the people he kept on retainer believed in big returns, and this was not a world that rewarded men who walked away from the race. The notes from the piano in the corner rolled like water under all these words. In his voice I heard a boy somewhere up a ladder, hammer in hand, wondering where to place the nail. If your happiness stands on a bent truth, I said it will not stand long. Sophia appeared as if summoned by the word truth. Black dress moving like ink, smile polished to a clean shine. She sat and placed a hand on the back of his chair. She thanked me for coming. She said money should be left to the people with the strength for it. She said I should enjoy peace. She said numbers confuse elders. I took a sip of water to keep my mouth from biting. I told her there was no confusion on my side. I told her I carried photographs of $8,000 checks made out to S. Torres. I told her I had a copy of an accountant's letter referencing dependent support for me. I told her I had internal emails that explained labels for transfers. I recited these items as if I were reading a grocery list for a simple dinner. Her smile evaporated. She sat straighter. She said documents like that required context and a trained eye. I answered that my context was a kitchen and a cold car and a warehouse floor. My context did not live in footnotes. My context lived in the bottom of a grocery bag and in the envelope from the power company. Michael stared at his hands. Then he lifted his head and tried to smile again. He said we were family and there would be a way. I stood. I said I am the house that keeps me now. I said I had given a lifetime and that in the center of the table I would leave a place for truth. I left the dining room without looking back. When the door closed, the piano went quiet. Outside, the air felt clear on my face. In the parking lot, I saved the recording and wrote down the details while they were hot in my hand. He named RB Care. He blamed a lost envelope. She flinched at the words checks and emails. I called Patricia and she listened without adding sound. That is a hook, she said at last. The fictional name, the lost paper, the denial pattern. Bring the file in the morning. We will send preservation again with new teeth. We may be able to make a new step. I went home to a room that was half shadow, half wind. I cooked rice and an egg and a line of chopped scallions. I ate like a man who had moved weight from one room to another. Then I opened the laptop and wrote a second post. I did not use names. I used a table with a spotless tablecloth and phrases that placed confusion in an older head. I asked what a father should do when he feels cold blowing through sentences at lunch with his own child. I pressed publish and closed the machine. My back settled into the chair as if the wood recognized me. Messages arrived as if a storm had changed direction. People wrote to say the facts matched their lives. People wrote to ask if they could demand statements when others claimed their names. One person said she had lived under a beautiful lie for 5 years and wanted to learn how to ask clean questions. I answered as many as I could. Do not fear the list of questions. Do not fear the notebook. Put every call and every receipt on paper. Near first light, my doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole. My landlord stood with his hands in his pockets and the wind in his eyes. He said 2 men had asked about me that afternoon. They asked about my schedule. He said he sent them away and told them he did not give out his tenants. He told me to call if I needed anything. I poured him a glass of water and thanked him. When the door closed, I stood with my back against it and felt my heart find its rhythm again. I called Patrick and told him about the visitors. He said pressure meant they feared a loss of control. He said fear meant we were not walking in circles. He said I should alter my routes and my hours to be less simple. I said I did not have much routine worth charting. He laughed softly and said, "Make new paths anyway." At lunch, I covered a shift for Janet. She handed me a small stack of papers someone she knew at a bank had passed quietly. The bank had received Patricia's letter and had logged a note to preserve. I nodded. A rope had been tied to another post. Janet asked where I thought this would lead. I said I could not count the steps remaining. I said I knew I was on the steps now instead of on the ground looking up. That was enough for a day. The following morning, I left another recording at Patricia's office and she played it back with the attention of a piano teacher listening for wrong notes. After she finished, she made a short call in another room. When she returned, she placed her hands on the desk and said the district attorney's office would meet us early next week. I did not need to attend the first meeting. When there was a formal appointment for the witness and the complainant, I would come. Until then, she asked me to do one simple thing that might open another door. Go back to the glass tower and ask for details about the unit held by ST Holdings, lease term, contact for payments. Any information a friendly gatekeeper might share without thinking the words would land on a desk in a courthouse. That afternoon, the lobby held a different guard. Younger, eager to be useful. I asked about putting my name on a waiting list. He brought out a form and a pen. I asked who managed the unit for ST Holdings. He turned to a computer screen and read off a name and an email address. He offered a card. I thanked him and placed it in the folder next to the flyer and the lease term. The pieces were learning each other's names. That evening, my small table held the shape of my case. 3 business cards, a copy of the condo purchase, 2 letters stamped with the word preserve, the signed statement from Maria, the anonymous envelope, the transcript of my lunch with my son and my daughter-in-law. I photographed the spread and saved it to a folder I had named with one word that made me feel steady: truth. I copied the folder to an external drive and slipped the drive into my jacket. Then I sat and listened to the building breathe. Someone walked barefoot upstairs. Pipes wrote small songs in the walls. A bus sighed and pulled away. The phone rang. A number I did not know. A woman's voice is refined and cold. Sophia. She said those posts hurt the reputation of the family. She said if I continued, she would have to consult a doctor about my capacity. She said Michael bore great pressures and I should not rest on his shoulders. I kept my voice level. I told her I had rested enough. I told her if the family's reputation stood on a father's back, then its weight should be lifted. She paused long enough to measure me and ended the call without a goodbye. I recorded the time and the words in the log. Each line was a small anchor driven into the hull as the water rose. That night, I dreamed of a white room and a box on a plain table. Inside the box, a key lay heavy and old. I lifted it and felt the grit of years in its grooves. When I turned it in the air, a small click sounded like a child catching breath after tears. In the morning, I remembered the sound and carried it with me like a charm. By noon the next day, Patricia called. The appointment with the district attorney was fixed on the calendar. Early next week. "Bring the folder and your calm voice," she said. Journalists had begun to send notes asking for comment. She asked me to wait. We would keep our pace. I promised I would only speak in the one place I controlled, my posts. One voice, one story. She said that was a good answer. I started my grocery shift a little early, and Janet looked at me and told me I was standing taller. I told her it might be my shoes. She tapped her glasses and said, "No, it was my back." We worked quietly, and then I moved to the warehouse for my night job. The fluorescent lights hummed like bees. I pulled the mop across the floor and watched the water spread in a shallow mirror. In it, my face wavered, and then steadied. I told that face that we were walking the right way. An hour before dinner, I received a short message. Alan. He wrote that there was movement inside the company. A manager had started asking about his departure. He believed there were a few more pieces of correspondence he could collect without raising an alarm. I told him to watch for his own safety first. I told him we could meet when the air felt friendlier. He agreed and signed off with a word that made him sound like a person my grandmother would have respected. Careful. Late that night, I added a small note to my page. Not to ignite, but to keep people informed without names or drama. I wrote about the way people use the word context to pull a rug from beneath a fact. I wrote about phone calls dressed as concern. I wrote that I had my hands ready to hold paper with me. I reminded readers that if someone told a story using their name, they had a right to see the numbers. The post did not explode. It traveled under the surface like water finding its own grade. Morning came dry and clear. I dropped copies at Patricia's office and walked in the park. A man my age read a newspaper on a bench. A child laughed at a kite with a tail of red ribbon. I opened the notebook and wrote a few lines. Fear was no longer in my hand. It stood a step away. I reached out. I touched another thing. Patience. Patrick called later to say the first meeting had gone well. The people across the table had listened. They wanted more paper, but what we had already carried was enough to permit a real appointment. He told me to eat like a man going on a long walk and to sleep like a man who would need to wake clear. I laughed and told him those two tasks were the hardest on my list. He laughed too and said we would break them into smaller pieces. I went home early. The refrigerator held air. I boiled potatoes and dipped them in salt. I ate slowly and thought of the people who had written to me. The hands I had not held felt as real as my own. I thought of Maria and her careful pen, Alan with a folder that weighed more than its pages, Janet with red frames on her nose, Patricia with strips of color marking the edges of the law. They formed a circle around me in my mind. They did not have to speak to be heard. Each placed a stone under my feet. I tidied my table and laid out the folder once more. I was no longer afraid to look directly at the scattered pieces. I saw their beginning and their end more clearly when they sat side by side. The 8,000 checks drawn to S. Torres, the cash purchase of the condo by ST Holdings, the accountant's letter naming me as a dependent support, the internal emails called transfers H support, the crude note telling me to stop, the statement Maria had signed, the recorded lunch, the card of the property manager. I photographed the arrangement as a family photo of facts. Then I closed the folder and hung it on the back of the chair like a coat. The night moved slowly, but it did not drag me under. I walked my small space and felt the floorboards answer. I placed my hand on the wall and took comfort in the cool. I thought of my first night in a warehouse long ago with secondhand boots. I thought of the first time I saw Michael hold his own infant son, and how that circle had felt complete. These memories did not make the present easier. They did not dull the work. They only stood marked as true in another file. The file labeled love. That file had not given me a reason to be silent now. Love and silence are not the same word. I sat at the table again. I wrote one line to close the day. Tomorrow a lock turns. I shut the book and switched off the lamp. I lay down with my hands on my chest and listened to my heart move slowly and even. I let my eyes close. I saw the white room again. I saw the box. I saw my hand take the old key and turn it without shaking. I listened for the sound. When it came small and clean, I smiled in the dark. Then I let sleep enter as if it knew the way through my apartment without turning on a light. The morning of the district attorney's meeting arrived colder than usual. I woke before the alarm, my body restless, my hands already reaching for the folder on the table as if my sleep had ended mid-thought. The pages inside had grown heavier with each passing week, not because of the paper, but because of the stories now attached to them. Maria's trembling signature, Alan's quiet defiance, Patricia's careful letters, and the voice recordings I had captured at the club. Each piece was a stone, and together they made a wall strong enough to lean against. I dressed in my best shirt, pressed it as straight as I could, and drove into the city. My Ford coughed smoke at the stoplights, and I wondered if the engine would betray me before I even reached the building. But it carried me through, as stubborn as I was, until the courthouse rose ahead like a slab of gray ice against the pale sky. Patricia met me at the entrance. She wore her confidence like a coat, neat and steady. She squeezed my shoulder and whispered that the key today was not anger, but clarity. The assistant district attorney, Jennifer Martinez, would be in the room. She was younger than us, but sharp, with a reputation for listening closely and cutting straight to the root of a case. Patricia told me to trust the truth and let it carry itself. Inside the conference room was plain: a long table, a carafe of water blinds half drawn against the morning light. Jennifer sat at the head, her hair tied back, her face serious but not unkind. She motioned for us to sit, and I placed the folder on the table between us. My fingers lingered on it for a second before I pushed it forward. Jennifer asked me to begin with my own words. Not the documents, not the legal terms. My words. So I told her. I told her about the Christmas party where my son had announced to a room full of executives that he gave me $8,000 a month. I told her about the silence that swallowed me as I stood in a borrowed suit, knowing I had eaten beans the night before because my paycheck had gone to rent. I told her about the look in my daughter-in-law's eyes, sharp with challenge, daring me to contradict the lie. I spoke about the days that followed, the confusion, the anger, the long nights of research at the library, the discovery of the checks made out to S. Torres Sophia's maiden name, the accountant's letter detailing dependent support arrangements for me, a fiction created for tax benefits. I told her about Maria's courage in signing a statement about Alan risking his career to slip me internal records about the recordings from the club where Michael insisted on trusts that did not exist. Jennifer listened without interruption, her pen moving only occasionally, her eyes steady on me. When I finished, the silence stretched for a moment, and then she asked a single question. "What do you want from this?" The room stilled around that question. I thought about it carefully. I told her I wanted the truth recognized, not just for me, but for everyone who had been used in similar ways. I told her I wanted the lies dismantled, the false image stripped away. I said I did not want revenge in blood or ruin, but I wanted justice in daylight. If they had stolen from me, from the law, from others, I wanted that theft dragged into the open, where it could not hide behind champagne toasts and polite applause. Jennifer nodded slowly. She said the evidence suggested multiple crimes, including elder financial abuse, tax fraud, and conspiracy. She said the scope might extend further than even I realized. She explained that cases like these could take months, sometimes years, but the pattern was already visible. She asked if I was willing to testify, if I was willing to let my life be examined under a glass. I told her I had already been stripped of dignity once in front of a crowd. I would rather be stripped again in pursuit of truth than continue to live invisible under lies. My voice shook, but it did not falter. Patricia slid the folder across the table. Jennifer opened it, leafing through the photographs of checks, the letters, the transcriptions. She paused on the crude note with the marker and nodded. She said this was not only financial manipulation but intimidation, and that mattered too. She promised her office would move forward with discretion, but also with resolve. When we left the courthouse, Patricia exhaled long and deep, as if she had been holding her breath for me. She told me I had done well, that my calm voice carried more weight than any angry speech could. We walked into the cold air, and I felt something shift inside me. For the first time in years, I believed the fight was not mine alone. That afternoon, I returned to my apartment and sat at the table in silence. I thought of Michael as a boy chasing a ball down the street, his laughter bouncing between houses. I thought of Sophia's eyes, calculating even in moments meant for joy. And I thought of myself bent over mops and shelves, invisible to the people who claimed to love me. The ache was still there, but it was joined by a steel thread of determination. The phone rang that evening. It was Michael. His voice was smoother than before, but underneath it ran a current of strain. He asked if I was comfortable, if I needed anything, and if I had enough food in the house. He said he was thinking of me. I let him speak until his words began to circle. Then I asked him directly why checks in Sophia's name matched the amount he had claimed to give me. Silence. Then he said I was misunderstanding that those payments were part of a broader family plan, that Sophia handled certain things for efficiency. I asked him what RB Care was, the trust he had named at the club. He hesitated, then said it was complicated legal structures, nothing I needed to worry about. I kept my tone steady. I told him I worried anyway. I told him I had learned to balance ledgers with pennies so I could understand $8,000 just fine. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound was thin. Finally, he told me we should meet soon, that face-to-face would clear the confusion. I agreed. I wrote the time and place in my notebook. After the call, I sat back and closed my eyes. I could almost see Sophia beside him, whispering what to say, shaping his excuses. I knew she was the architect, but I also knew Michael had chosen to stand on her side. That knowledge cut deeper than any insult. The next few days passed in fragments. Maria called to tell me she had seen Sophia arguing with Michael behind closed doors, her voice sharp enough to pierce the walls. Alan sent me a message that he might have one final set of documents, but he was being watched. Patricia updated me that the DA's office had begun issuing subpoenas quietly. At night, I returned to my posts. My invisible woman, though I was not a woman but a man too often unseen. I wrote carefully without names, but with details sharp enough to slice. I wrote about lies wrapped in champagne. I wrote about trust accounts that never sent statements. I wrote about how silence can be heavier than any arm across your shoulders. Each post spread further, each comment thread a chorus of voices saying they recognized themselves in the story. And then came the twist I had not expected. One evening, an email arrived from someone I did not know. The subject line was simple: I believe you. Inside was a letter from a man in Houston who claimed Sophia had once approached him in the same way years before Michael. She had convinced him to invest in a boutique business, drained his funds, and disappeared. He had never pursued charges, ashamed to admit he had been fooled. Now, reading my words, he realized he had not been alone. I forwarded the email to Patricia. She called me immediately. This changes the scope, she said. This shows a pattern stretching beyond your case. If more victims come forward, the DA will have grounds for broader charges. The realization settled heavily in my chest. This was no longer just about me and Michael. This was about every man or woman who had been caught in Sophia's net. The days that followed were a blur of preparation. Patricia scheduled another meeting. Alan arranged a risky handoff in a parking lot, giving me copies of emails between Michael and Sophia discussing tax shelters and dependent claims. Maria promised to stand firm if questioned. Each ally seemed to carry a piece of the weight I had borne alone for too long. But the nights were hardest. Alone in my apartment, I replayed Michael's words, his laughter as a child, his hollow reassurances as a man. I asked myself where I had gone wrong, what love had turned into. There were no answers, only the cold knowledge that truth sometimes splits families the way storms split trees. One evening I dreamed of the Christmas party again. The chandeliers, the applause, the glass, and Sophia's smile. But in the dream, when Michael said $8,000 a month, I spoke. I told the room I drove a rusting Ford, that I ate beans, that I scrubbed warehouses to live. In the dream, the room went silent, faces pale, and I walked out taller than I had gone in. When I woke, I realized the dream was no longer a fantasy. It was a rehearsal. I knew what was coming. Another gathering, another stage. They would not be the only ones to speak this time. As I lay back in the quiet, I whispered to myself that patience was no longer silent. Patience was waiting until the truth could not be denied. The walls of lies were cracking, and soon the whole room would hear the sound. And I would not whisper. I would speak. They had set the room in navy and gold again, the same colors that had wrapped the lie in ribbons months ago. A microphone waited near the cake like a dare. I touched the tablecloth to steady my hands and felt the linen cool under my fingers. The first time I stood here, the lie arrived in a tuxedo and asked everyone to clap. Tonight, the truth would walk in without music. I had carried it long enough. It had its own legs now. They called it an investor appreciation dinner. The club had polished itself to a polite shine. The chandelier threw light in circles across fine china and stemware. Servers flowed through the room with choreography that made labor look effortless. I watched their hands. Work has a way of telling on itself in the fingers. It had been told to me for years. Patricia met me in the foyer before the doors opened. She placed a palm on my sleeve and asked for one thing. Slow steps, no rush. Your words know where to go. Trust them and keep your cadence. She told me Jennifer had texted earlier that the preservation letters had landed and that subpoenas had begun to take shape. This mattered for later. Tonight was about air and sound. Inside faces I knew by type but not by name turned toward the bar and toward each other. The men wore confidence like a second skin. The woman wore balance, one eye on a conversation and one eye on the room. Michael stood near the far wall, a circle forming around him without effort. He had the kind of smile that made cameras believe his mouth. Tonight, it did not convince his eyes. Sophia moved among donors with that glide she had learned somewhere between charm and calculation. She reached a hand to a wrist here and there, light grasp, gentle laugh, small promise wrapped in a nod. Every gesture said, "I am in control, I am necessary, I am the answer." Maria passed behind my chair with a tray and allowed herself a half-breath of a smile in my direction. That was enough. Alan had managed a ticket through a vendor friend and stood near a column with a soda in his hand, posture loose, eyes sharp. He did not approach me. He did not need to. Allies do not always move closer. Sometimes they hold their ground and let you know the direction is clear. I sat with Margaret Walsh and 3 other spouses whose names slid from my head as soon as they were spoken. Margaret touched my elbow. She whispered that she had read every word of my last post. She whispered that she had not known a thing could be so public and so private at the same time. I told her quietly that love often grows in the shadow of both. She stared at her glass for a long moment. Then she told me she hoped that whatever happened next would be clean. Clean mattered more to her than victory. A small stage rose near the band. The club manager announced that dinner would be brief and remarks briefer. He laughed at his own line. The room laughed with him because rooms like this are trained to laugh when told. As salad plates landed, Sophia came to our table and leaned in with a smile that had sharp edges. She asked if I was comfortable. She hoped I would enjoy the show. I told her I had already been on the show once. Tonight, I came as the audience. She lifted one eyebrow and then drifted away. I watched her whisper something to Michael. He shook his head almost imperceptibly. She spoke again, lower this time. He adjusted his cufflink and looked toward the door that led to the terrace. I wondered if he was measuring the distance to exit signs. Course by course, the room softened. Wine loosened shoulders. People forgot to hide. I let the noise wash over me, a tide against a seawall, steady and dull. When the plates cleared and the band paused, the club manager tapped the microphone and did the thing men like him have done in rooms like this for years. He asked the host to say a few words. Michael stepped into the light. He thanked everyone for their partnership and their faith. He spoke of milestones and projections, and the word legacy fell from his mouth as if it had a safe landing. He did not mention family. He did not mention care. When he finished, the applause felt practiced, like a reflex tested and strong. Margaret touched my sleeve again and whispered that I should stand. I did not need a whisper. I was already rising. Patricia had told me to take my time, so I took it. I walked toward the front slowly enough for the room to realize something unscripted was happening. The club manager reached for the microphone and found my eyes instead. He held out the stand as if he were handing me a glass of water. I faced the room and did not begin with names. I began with my hands. I thanked the servers for carrying heavy plates without a sound. I thanked the staff for arranging chairs so that the room looked like a picture. I thanked the band for making the air in our lungs feel borrowed from a happier time. People smiled because people like thanks when it is not for them. Then I turned the thank you toward the person I had been. I told the room I had stood in that very space months ago and listened to a story told about me. I told them the story saying I received $8,000 every month because I had been good once and because my son was generous. I told them I went home that night to a refrigerator that held a jug of water and an onion to a car that offered cold as a passenger to a shift that began when other people slept. I told them I did not know how to clap for that story. My hands refused me. I saw heads tilt without anyone meaning to move them. I saw the line of Michael's mouth harden. I saw Sophia's expression flatten into a mask that belonged to a different room. I told them I had asked quietly, and been told gently that age confuses numbers. I told them I had found checks that never had my name, a letter that placed my life as a deduction, and emails that taught people how to label a lie. I said I was not accusing anyone of anything in this room. I was only saying that the account connected to my name sent me nothing, while the mouth connected to that same name spoke loudly about care. I let the words sit on the table between us like a bowl of fruit no one wanted to touch first. A murmur began near the back, moved like wind through dry grass, and settled in the corners. Someone stood. A man with a face I did not know, but a voice that carried. He said he had seen a young woman years ago before this marriage, who moved money through promises and left men with empty accounts and full shame. He said he had kept that story quiet because quiet felt safer. He said reading what I had written made quiet feel like a slow poison. Then he sat down. His hands shook. There were people near him who stared at Sophia as if measuring her for the first time. Michael stepped forward and said that his father had misunderstood that family finances were complex by necessity, that any checks mentioned were part of a broader plan. He used words like fiduciary and strategy, and he tried to smile between them. He looked over my shoulder as if aiming his sentences past me at someone who mattered more. That was when I remembered that I had been invisible in this room once. Tonight I kept myself in my own line of sight. I told him I was no longer confused and that I would be relieved to be proven wrong by paper. I invited anyone in the room who believed I had received $8,000 a month to accompany me to a bank. I invited them to lay their eyes on deposits, not promises. I said that if I had been in error, I would stand again in this room and apologize to every person present. I felt Patricia exhale across the room. I felt a stillness arrive. It felt like a key turning. Sophia took the microphone with that smoothness of hers and told the room that this was not the time or place. She told them that families had seasons and that elders sometimes forgot arrangement details. It was a gentle blow aimed at my knees. I stood through it. I said my memory held the warehouse floor and the cans of beans with perfect clarity. I said my bank account held facts no season could rearrange. I said again that I welcomed any daylight she wished to bring to my records. Margaret spoke from her table without standing. She asked Michael a question that cut through the carpet and the china and the practiced smiles. "Is it true? Do you actually support your father?" Michael said yes, and the room did not move. Margaret asked where the money went then. That question hung in the air like a chandelier with a loose chain. Another voice rose. Richard Hoffman, a client I had heard about but never met, asked how checks made out to a woman with the initials ST could count as support for a man with the initials RB. The fact that someone in the room had read carefully and connected initials before this night told me the story had unspooled in places I could not see. Phones were out. Faces leaned over screens. The room was not staying in the room anymore. Sophia told the club manager to cut the mic. He did not. Perhaps he had learned something about the cost of being the hand that turns the sound down when truth is finding its pitch. Michael reached for my arm. He said, "Let us step outside and talk as men." I told him I had spoken as a man all my life and been told to keep my voice somewhere safe and small. I told him I was done with small. I said I would step outside when I had finished saying what my bones had carried to this carpet. I told the room I loved my son. I told them love had nothing to do with being used as a shield. I told them love does not require poverty to make someone else look rich. I told them I had given my name so that others could lift theirs. That was over now. The word over made something in Michael's face collapse. He tried to find the smile again and could not. Sophia gathered her purse and told him they were leaving. She said the room was sick and would infect them if they stayed. No one followed. Some looked away, some did not. When she reached the door, a server stepped aside to let her pass. The band held their instruments like men holding hats in a church vestibule, unsure of where to look. When the door closed behind them, the room did not breathe for a heartbeat. Then people began to move not toward the dessert table or the bar, but toward me. They did not come for the spectacle. They came with questions, and with something softer that moved behind the questions. Apology. I heard it in phrases like I did not know, and I should have asked, and we all liked the story too much. A man I had never met pressed a card into my hand and said his firm had a forensic team and that he owed his mother better than the silence he had kept. A woman from a charity board said she had already drafted an email to withdraw a sponsorship Sophia had sought. She asked if I needed a ride home. That simple offer held more dignity than 1,000 toasts. Patricia reached me last. She said nothing right away. She let the room empty around us a little. Then she told me that whatever they did next in the dark would be less effective now that the lights had come up. She said Jennifer would be ready to move faster, and that the subpoenas would land with a different sound after tonight. She asked if I felt steady. I told her I felt like a man who had been carrying a chair and just put it down. On the terrace, the air bit sweetly at my face. The club lights turned the grass into a painting. Somewhere downtown, a siren slid along the spine of the city. I leaned on the railing and found that my hands were not shaking. Maria stepped outside for a minute with a tray of coffee cups. She placed it on a small table and stood near me as if we were two people waiting for a bus. She said softly that I had done what she could not. I told her she had done what I could not. She had stayed brave where bravery cost rent. We did not need to say more. On the way to the parking lot, Margaret caught up. She walked in those careful heels of hers like a woman who had learned long ago how to make noise only when she wanted to. She told me she would carry this night into rooms I would never enter. She said that was her part. I told her to let the room hear the sentence about records and daylight louder than any sentence about shame. She nodded and smiled for the first time in months. My Ford started on the second try. I drove slowly past the club and watched light spill onto the drive. In the rearview mirror, the building looked smaller than it had when I arrived. I did not play the radio. I let my mind replay the exact words I had used. I tested them for cracks. I found the places my breath had caught and filed that away for later. I called Patricia from a red light. She told me to go home and put the folder on the table and leave it alone until morning. She said to eat something warm before sleep. She said victory tasted better with broth than with adrenaline. At home, I did as she said. I heated the soup until the steam rose like prayer and drank it slowly. Then I opened the folder anyway and placed the club business card I had collected on top of the stack. It felt like adding a leaf to a family album. The phone lit up with messages. Jennifer wrote that she had seen the crowd videos already and that this would help. Alan wrote 3 words that made my chest ache with gratitude. You were plain. Maria sent a small heart. Janet sent a picture of her red glasses and the words, "Proud of you, old man." I sent back a smile I could feel in my cheeks. I set the phone face down and the apartment returned to its small noises. The hallway groaned as someone dragged a bag. The radiator clinked like a spoon against a glass. I walked to the window and looked out at the street that had watched me carry myself through quiet years. I thought of Michael somewhere with Sophia weighing their next move. He had always been good at calculating distance. It was the weight of things that had tricked him. I could not solve that for him. I had finally stopped trying. Sleep did not arrive right away. It came in pieces the way good things do when they have been kept waiting at the door too long. When it did take me, I dreamed not of rooms and applause, but of a field behind the house where Michael had been small. We had flown a kite there when the wind cooperated. In the dream, the kite went up easily and stayed. I held the string in one hand and the handle in the other. I let him run ahead and I did not shout instructions. The string vibrated with a steady energy that was its own. I woke with my hand still curved as if holding something light and taut. Morning would bring calls and emails and maybe more threats written with heavy marker strokes. It would bring questions from people whose jobs gave them the authority to ask and people whose curiosity felt a lot like gossip. It would bring a meeting date with the district attorney and likely a request from a reporter whose name had reached my inbox more than once. It would bring decisions about how to keep the story simple when others tried to make it complicated. But for now, it brought coffee and the sound of my own breath. I sat at the table with the folder shut tight and the notebook open. I wrote the time and the place and the sentences that mattered most. I wrote that I had asked to see the paper. I wrote that I had offered to apologize if I had been wrong. I wrote that a room had fallen quiet enough to hear a life without music. I wrote that the truth had not been shouted. It had stepped forward, adjusted its cuffs, and stood there with its hands open. Then I wrote one more line and let the pen rest. The doors are open now. Let the light do its work. The morning after the dinner at the country club, the sun slid through the blinds in lines so sharp it felt like the world was cutting me into sections. I had slept little, but not out of fear. It was the sort of wakefulness that comes when your body knows something irreversible has already begun. Coffee steamed in my chipped mug, and for the first time in years, I let it cool without rushing. My hands were steady. That told me everything I needed to know. By 8, Patricia called. Her voice carried that clipped rhythm lawyers have when adrenaline and professionalism meet. She said the videos from last night were already moving online. Guests had posted fragments. Some are only a few seconds long, but enough to show my face and my words about checks that never reached me. She told me local reporters were calling her office asking for statements. She asked if I felt ready. Ready is a strange word. When a man spends decades working graveyard shifts to keep lights on for someone else, he is always ready in a way and never ready in another. I told her I was not afraid. That seemed to settle her. She told me Jennifer at the DA's office had moved our meeting up to that afternoon. I walked to the library that morning with my folder under my arm. People passed me with the distracted pace of city life, but I noticed something different. 2 men near the bus stop stopped talking when I passed. A woman with a grocery bag looked at me twice as though she recognized a shape she had only seen on a screen. I realized the invisible man had begun to cast a shadow again. At the library computer, I searched my own name. The blog posts had grown legs. Forums repeated them. A Dallas business gossip column had already connected the initials ST to Sophia Torres Bell. Some comments defended Michael. Others called it elder financial abuse. Reading strangers weigh your life is like hearing your own story in a language you barely understand. It is yours and not yours at the same time. By noon, I closed the computer and walked to the courthouse. The glass front reflected the sky like a polished blade. Inside, Patricia and Jennifer waited in a small room that smelled of paper and coffee that had sat too long. Jennifer shook my hand firmly and said she had been impressed by my calmness in the videos. She said that composure would matter later when people tried to paint me as confused. She asked me to tell the story again from the beginning. I started with the Christmas party and carried it through the late nights in the warehouse. The blog posts the discovery of checks to S. Torres. Patricia occasionally added detail from the photographs we had collected. Jennifer listened without interrupting except to clarify dates. Her pen moved quickly. When I finished, she leaned back and folded her hands. She said the evidence pointed to multiple charges: tax fraud, elder financial abuse, possibly money laundering if they traced company funds into personal accounts. She asked if I understood that this might mean my son could face prison. I told her I understood. She asked if I was prepared for the defense to attack me personally, to call me senile, bitter, manipulative. I told her I had already lived through worse attacks delivered in silence while working 3 jobs. This time I had truth on my side. Jennifer nodded slowly and said her office would move forward with search warrants. She asked me to remain cautious. Do not engage with reporters yet. Do not speak with Michael or Sophia. Let the process breathe. I promised her I would. Walking home, the city looked sharper. Billboards bright as accusations. Cars rushing with the noise of impatience. I felt oddly light, as if I had left a weight on the courthouse table. But the day was not done. That evening, Alan came by with takeout. He set the bag on my table and told me he had seen the videos. He asked if I knew I had gone viral. I told him I was beginning to learn what that word meant. He shook his head and said people at his job were talking about me like I was a character in a film. He said it was surreal to watch his old neighbor become a headline. We ate in silence for a while. Then Alan said he had once admired Michael. The ambition was the polish, the way he seemed to carry a room. He said watching him turn that ambition into a weapon against me had broken something in him too. He told me he was proud of me. That word felt strange in my direction. It was the word I had once reserved for my son. Later that night, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. Against Patricia's advice, I answered. Michael's voice came through low and tight. He asked why I was trying to ruin him. He said the videos had caused investors to pull back. He said Sophia had been humiliated at lunch with her board. He asked if I was happy now. I told him happiness was not the right word. I told him I was tired of lies. He said everything could have been handled privately. I told him he had chosen the stage first when he announced money that never reached me. He was silent for a long time. Then he said I would regret this. His voice cracked on the word regret. The line went dead. I sat at my table long after the call ended. The city hummed outside the window. I thought about the boy who had once run across a field with a kite string in his hand. I wondered how that boy had become a man who threatened his own father. Then I stopped wondering. Some questions have no answer that heals. The next morning, the Dallas Morning News printed an article on the front page. The headline spoke of elder abuse allegations against a local entrepreneur. My name filled the first paragraph. The photograph showed me at the microphone at the club, my face set in a calm I barely remembered holding. Calls came from numbers I did not recognize. Reporters, strangers, supporters. I ignored most. Maria sent a text that simply said, "I am with you." Margaret called to tell me several people from the dinner were prepared to speak to authorities about what they had heard. Richard Hoffman emailed copies of old documents connecting Sophia to previous scams. The net was widening, and I was no longer pulling alone. That afternoon, Patricia stopped by. She spread papers across my table showing preliminary findings from the subpoenas. Transfers from Michael's company to Sophia's accounts. Records of cash withdrawals timed to match the supposed allowance payments. A spreadsheet labeled HB Trust with no trust attached. Each page was another nail in a coffin they had built for themselves. I asked Patricia if there was still a chance Michael could turn back. She studied me for a long moment before answering. She said sometimes people find a way to admit wrong and rebuild. She said more often the pattern of lies is too deep. She said I needed to be ready for the latter. I told her I was. As night fell, I sat by the window watching headlights trace the street. My phone buzzed again with messages from strangers thanking me for speaking up. One woman wrote that her brother had taken her pension and told the family he was investing it for her. She said my story had given her the courage to call an attorney. Another said her daughter-in-law controlled all her checks and she had been too ashamed to tell anyone. She said she now realized she was not alone. Reading those words, I understood something. This fight was no longer about Michael alone. It was about every invisible parent hidden behind stories of generosity that never existed. It was about every lie wrapped in champagne and applause. It was about showing that silence does not have to be the final inheritance. Sleep came slowly again, but it came with less bitterness. I dreamed of standing in a field not alone but surrounded by people holding their own kites. Each string hummed with wind and possibility. And when I woke, I knew the next step was not just survival. It was a transformation. The days ahead would be brutal. Reporters at my door, lawyers sharpening their arguments, family members whispering, but I was no longer afraid of being erased. I had spoken. The truth had walked into the room and refused to leave, and that truth was growing louder every day. That was the beginning of part 7 of my story, a chapter not of defeat, but of the first real glimpse of victory. Not because my son was failing, but because I had stopped letting lies define me. The fight had shifted. The invisible man had become visible, and there was no turning back. Before dawn, a hard knocking split the quiet and sent me upright in bed. For a moment, I could not find the room. Then the sound came again, and the hallway light bled under the door like a blade. I pulled on a shirt and opened up to 2 officers in plain jackets with badges at their belts. Behind them, the corridor glowed blue and red as if the night itself had started breathing through the walls. The taller one said good morning by name and handed me a paper. Search warrants were being executed. Not here, at Michael's office, at his house, at the bank that held the accounts connected to my name. He said I did not need to come anywhere. He said I might get phone calls. He said I should call Patricia before I called anyone else. When the door clicked shut, the room felt different. The air was cooler and I could hear distant footsteps moving like news along the hall. I stood still long enough for the first tremor to pass through my hands and leave. Then I filled the kettle. I watched steam turn the kitchen window into a white square and tried to imagine boxes being carried down a driveway that had refused me a place to park. The kettle whistled. I poured coffee and opened the notebook. I wrote the time and the words from the badge. I wrote that the day had shifted. Patricia called while the mug was still too hot to hold. Her voice carried calm and urgency braided together. She said teams were on site. She said Jennifer had coordinated 3 locations at once. She said I should stay put but keep my phone on. Then she did a thing she had started doing without remark. She reminded me to eat. It sounded like a small thing until you realize how many days in a hard life are lived on the other side of hunger. By 8, the first photos began to appear online. A line of cars outside Michael's office, a doorway half blocked by men with boxes. The company logo was shining behind them like a sign that had lost its meaning. Someone had filmed a short clip from across the street. In it, you could see a woman with dark hair and a black coat talking too fast to a man in a suit who did not look up. I had to lean in before my mind allowed the shape to become Sophia. She looked smaller than she had ever allowed herself to look. Maria texted me 2 words. "They are here." I forced myself not to respond. The less she wrote, the safer she would be. I put the phone face down and let the room return to its normal size. Then the phone buzzed again. Jennifer. She said they were in. She said documents had been secured from the office safe that included a ledger for something labeled HB Trust with no corresponding account in any banking system. She said when the agents asked for statements, Sophia had tried to produce a spreadsheet printed the night before. Jennifer's voice held no triumph, only a kind of steady light that made me feel taller in my kitchen. By late morning, Patricia arrived with a folder thicker than mine. She set it on the table and waited for me to nod before opening it. Inside lay photocopies made in a room I would not see, checks to S. Torres lined up like a parade, transfers from the business account into a personal account with a name I did not know, and from there into the condo holding company we had already traced. A letter from the accountant, again this one with handwritten margin notes that did not belong to a cautious man. The notes said things like, under the threshold we avoid audit and label as HB Care for Optics. My name had been written as a tag. I had become a category. Patricia watched my face. She did not say I told you so. She asked if I wanted to take a break. I shook my head. We turned a page together and there it was. A scanned signature in my name on a document authorizing an automatic transfer to a trust that did not exist. The signature looked like a stranger trying to dress in my handwriting. Close enough for a glance, wrong enough for a heart. The last letter in my last name had been flattened, as if the person who forged it did not know I always lifted my pen there. I felt heat rise to my neck like shame that did not belong to me. Patricia reached for a pen and circled the signature without touching it. She said the bank would have to account for its due diligence. She said forgery changed the legal terrain. She said this was not only a story about money, it was a story about identity. I wanted to laugh and could not. Identity had felt like a rumor in my life for years, standing in rooms where I was thanked for sacrifices I could no longer afford. Now identity sat on my table in a line of cramped letters pretending to be my name. My phone rang with an unknown number. I glanced at Patricia. She nodded once. I answered. Michael came through with a voice made of brittle kindness. He asked if I had seen the news. He said everything was a misunderstanding and that the authorities always overreach in the beginning. He said he wanted to meet and resolve this like family. I let him speak until he began to circle his own words. Then I told him I had seen a signature in my name on a transfer instruction I had never signed. I told him the last letter was wrong. Silence held for 3 breaths. Then he said, I must be mistaken. He said I had signed something years ago. He said memory is a tricky thing. Patricia scribbled a note and slid it toward me. Ask him where and when. Ask him who the banker is. I followed the lines. He said a date that did not match any calendar in my head. He said a bank branch I had never entered. He said a name I wrote down to hand to Jennifer. Then he said a softer thing. He said Dad, and the world broke like a cheap plate. He hung up before I could answer. We sat without sound for a while. Then Patricia packed the folder and said we had a meeting at the DA's office within the hour. She put a hand on my shoulder without weight. We went down the stairs together. The hallway smelled like old paint. Outside, the cold tasted like iron. The city felt less like a place and more like a machine shifting gears. Jennifer met us with a tired smile and a table already set for more paper. She said the search had produced what she had hoped, and more than she had allowed herself to expect. She read aloud a portion of a text thread between Michael and Sophia. Keep the parent support number stable. Move actual to S. He will never check. The words fell into the room like small stones and collected at my feet. Jennifer did not look at me when she read the worst one. Your dad is finally useful. She kept her eyes on the page because she knew where my eyes had to go. Down, away, then back up. I asked her what came next. She said her office would present to a grand jury within weeks, maybe sooner. She said federal partners were watching the tax pieces and the movement of company funds. She said my calm would remain my strength if cameras appeared at my door. She told me again not to engage Michael or Sophia. She thanked me for holding the line. On the way out, we passed a wall of framed photographs of prosecutors long retired, men and women with the posture of people whose days had been built from other people's worst hours. Patricia stopped at the elevator and watched the floor number blink down. She said the next phase would bring noise. She said noise loves attention and eats time. She said we would decide in advance where and when to speak so we did not end up performing for strangers. I said I would follow her lead. She said I already knew the rhythm. I returned home to find a note slid under my door. No envelope this time, no marker stench. The message had been typed and printed and then folded without care. It told me to stop if I cared about peace. It told me I did not know everything. It told me families survive only when their weak parts stay quiet. I held the paper in my hand until the heat of my skin traveled through it. Then I slid it into a sleeve and wrote the time on the edge. I put it with the other papers where it belonged. I would not let fear live in a drawer where I could not see it. That night, Alan came by again, breath fogging in the hallway. He carried a small radio a friend from the station had loaned him to monitor scanners. He said he had never done anything like this before. He set it on the counter and found a calm channel. He said he wanted to be useful. We listened to the radio whisper an alphabet of codes that meant more to other people than to us. Between bursts of jargon, Alan spoke of his mother in Ohio and how she had once hidden receipts from his father to keep the house fed. He said he could not bear to think of me eating beans alone while my name bought linen and chandeliers. I told him there had been worse dinners in the world. I told him the beans had their own kind of dignity. He looked at me with wet eyes and said dignity should come with a full stomach. I changed the subject to spare us both. I asked him about the spreadsheets. He said more had been located than he expected. He said a system of internal labels mapped to external transfers with a choreographer's precision. He said someone had been proud of their own cleverness. He said cleverness often thinks it is invisible. We turned off the radio, and he left quietly. I washed the dishes with care as if their survival mattered in a way documents could not. Then I sat and wrote a short post. I wrote about forgery without saying the word. I wrote about the way a letter shape can betray a person who has spent a lifetime signing in the same small hand. I wrote about the difference between a name used and a name lived. I did not ask for sympathy. I asked for attention to detail. I told readers who had been given stories about trust accounts to ask for statements made on paper older than a day. By midnight, my inbox was filled with lines that shared the same shape. People had recognized their own handwriting in the wrong places. A man said his daughter had opened a credit line in his name and used it to argue he had been taken care of. A woman said her son-in-law had set up a folder labeled Mom Support that contained nothing but photos from holiday dinners. Pattern became a chorus. The chorus became a kind of proof that no single case could provide. The next morning, Jennifer called early. Her voice held the kind of fatigue that comes from running on steady effort instead of sleep. She said the bank manager named by Michael had denied any meeting with me or any signature session. She said surveillance footage at the branch that day showed Sophia walking out with a folder and a man beside her who was not me. She said the footage would hold up. I sat down without meaning to. The chair made a soft sound against the floor. Identity theft had been a line on a list. Now it had a face and a date. Around noon, Margaret called with news that did not belong in a quiet kitchen. She said a board she served on had voted to pause all partnerships with Sophia's boutique ventures. She said some of the women who had clapped in December had begun to say out loud what they had only thought. She said shame had a way of moving through rooms faster than approval. She asked if I was all right. I told her I was not, but that I was holding. In the afternoon, a local reporter left a card in my mailbox with a handwritten note asking for 5 minutes when I was ready. She wrote that her mother had lived a story like mine and that she would tell it one day under her own name. I considered ignoring the card. Patricia had asked for silence until the grand jury, but something in the neat cursive and the word mother loosened a thread in me. I called Patricia and read the note. She weighed the risks in a breath. Then she told me to offer the reporter one rule: no names, only a wider truth. We met at the library in a corner near the biographies. The reporter was younger than I expected and carried a small recorder and a notebook. She asked me to speak the way I wrote. I said that might be the kindest thing anyone had asked me to do. I told her about the lie that entered a room in a tuxedo. I told her about the mop and the warehouse light. I told her about checks written to a marriage rather than to a father. I told her about a signature that did not belong to my hand. She did not interrupt. At the end, she said the piece would not be about scandal. It would be about a shape of silence that had lived too long in this city. When the article ran the next day, it did not put my face on the front page. It placed my words inside where the readers who wanted more than spectacle would find them. The comments underneath surprised me. Men wrote about fathers they had disappointed and about mothers who had forgiven them too easily. Women wrote about bank visits that had ended with a shrug from a manager and a note of pity that did not change the account. The piece did not explode. It settled into the town like rain after a dry winter. That evening, a shadow fell across my peephole and stayed. A soft knock. Not the hard rap of a badge. I asked who was there through the woods. Michael answered. He said he wanted to talk like family. I stood with my palm on the doorknob and did not turn it. He said he was alone. He said Sophia had gone to stay with a friend. He said he needed my help. The word need woke an old reflex in me. The reflex reached for the handle. The man I had become did not. I told him we could speak with the door between us. He said that was ridiculous. He said he had been humiliated in rooms I would never enter. He said investors had turned their backs and that one of their restaurants had been dropped by a distributor. I told him humiliation was not a legal defense. He said I sounded like Patricia. He meant it as an insult. I took it as a measure of my progress. He leaned his forehead against the door and lowered his voice. He said he wished he had handled things differently. He said he had believed he could make it right before I ever knew. He said he was sorry that it had come to this. I stood very still because old love moves when old words appear. Then he asked me to make a statement that said I had been confused. He said it would calm everything and that he would take care of me. The reflex inside me laughed once and then died. I told him I would not lie for him to repair the lying. I told him the word sorry could not hold the weight he needed it to hold. I told him the only sentence he could say that would change anything would require paper and proof. He went very quiet. Then he said quietly that without me speaking for him, he would go to jail. I told him that without him speaking the truth, he should. He cursed under his breath and walked away. His footsteps faded and the building settled around me like a body remembering sleep. I sank into the chair and let my heart slow. I wrote the time and the words he had used. My hand did not shake. A small mercy. The next day, James from my old shift at the warehouse called to say he had seen me on the news and that the guys had sent their respect. He said they had always wondered how I could work 2 jobs and stay quiet about pain. He said they were rooting for the old man with the notebook. I laughed and felt something unclench. The world beyond chandeliers had been watching too. Patricia called with a date. The grand jury would sit the following week. She said Jennifer wanted me nearby, but not in the building itself. She asked me to bring the originals of what I had kept and to trust the process once more. I said I would and meant it. Trust had been used against me for too long. It felt strange and right to give it back to the people who had earned it. That evening I took a bus to the park instead of driving. I walked the path where we had once flown kites and let the cold bite my cheeks. A little boy ran with his arms wide while his mother laughed and told him to slow down. I stood with my hands in my pockets and watched the string of his plastic kite stretch clean against the winter sky. The boy did not look back to check the line. He knew his mother held it. I had been that mother and that boy in different seasons of my life. Tonight I was simply a man watching wind carry a bright thing upward without asking permission. I went home and set my folder on the table. I made tea and let it sit until it cooled. I opened the notebook and wrote the first line of a new page. I wrote that a forged signature cannot live forever under the weight of a real name. I wrote that the knock before dawn had not been an ending. It had been a beginning dressed in a harder sound. I wrote that my son had come to my door and walked away without the story he wanted, and that I had remained standing after he left. Then I closed the book and sat in the quiet and let my breath move in and out like a small tide. Sleep came more easily that night. I dreamed of paper transforming into windows, and of windows opening to let a cold, clean wind pass through rooms that had not been aired in years. In the morning, I would go to Patricia's office with my originals in a bag that had once carried lunches to a warehouse floor. In the morning, the city would wake again with its own worries and wants. In the morning, I would pour coffee and bring the cup to my lips and know that whatever waited on the other side of the day, I had stepped into it with my name intact. The day the grand jury met began with a sound I had not heard since my years on construction sites. A siren somewhere far off, not urgent for me, but near enough to press the air flat against the window. I lay still and counted my breaths until my chest loosened. I had promised myself one simple thing for this day: move slowly. No rushing, not in thought, not in speech, not from one room to the next. I brewed coffee, burned the first toast, laughed quietly at my own hands, and made another piece. The small, clumsy mercy of breakfast steadied me more than any speech could have. Patricia texted before 7. She said she would swing by to pick me up. She wanted me nearby, but not in the building. Jennifer had asked us to remain within reach. There would be waiting, and then there would be a call. She added a line that read like a hand on the shoulder: "You do not need to carry more than your name today. Bring yourself and the original folder." I set the folder on the table and ran my palm across its top. Each page inside had become a marker in a trail through a forest I had once been told did not exist. Checks to Sophia's maiden name. The accountant's letter that turned my life into a deduction. The crooked signature that carried my name like a costume. The anonymous threats that tried to teach me fear. Maria's careful statement. Alan's printed emails. Photographs of flyers and doorways and a checkbook face open on a desk. The folder was not as thick as court records go, but it held enough weight to tilt a scale. At 8:15, we eased through traffic toward downtown. Patricia drove with that calm focus I had seen her wear like a second skin. She said very little. I watched the city pass glass shining against winter light delivery trucks shouldering their way through lanes, a jogger with a neon cap moving past the courthouse steps with an ease that made me smile. Life did not pause for grand juries. That felt like a good thing. The world had room for both the ordinary and the turning of a key. We waited in a small office on a floor below where the panel met. Jennifer stepped in long enough to squeeze my hand and say, "Today is only one step." Then she disappeared back into a hallway where the rules did not want me. So waiting was the work. Patricia opened her laptop and arranged tabs like cards. I opened my notebook and wrote the date, the time, the temperature in the room, the taste of the coffee, and the sound of a fan overhead. Small facts, plain as stones, lay in a row across the page. About an hour and the first message arrived. Maria had just been called and was on her way up with an investigator. She wrote, "Thank you, sir," and added a small blue heart. I sent a single word back: courage. Then I set the phone face down again. I had promised Jennifer I would not distract witnesses. A promise is a better use of courage than speeches are. While we waited, Patricia briefed me on the order of witnesses. Bank officers first, then a forensic accountant to teach money how to speak to strangers, then Mariah, then someone from Michael's office whose name I did not recognize. After lunch, the manager from the condo tower. And if time allowed, the recordings. She reminded me that I would not go in today. She said the panel would see me later if needed. For now, the goal was to lay a road for them to drive on. The phone buzzed again, a number I did not know. I let it ring out and listened to the voicemail. It was a lawyer who introduced himself as counsel for Michael and for Sophia. He said a cease and desist letter was on its way regarding defamatory statements made online and at private gatherings. He suggested that I might want to consider my legacy. I handed the phone to Patricia and watched the heat rise in her neck. She wrote a short reply and sent it from her own line. She said, "We acknowledge receipt of your message and that all further communication should be directed to the district attorney." Then she smiled at me without humor and said, "Noise, just noise." Late morning fell into that blur that only waiting can make. The windows showed the city at work. I thought of my old crew polishing warehouse floors to a shine that made the night look clean. I thought of Janet arranging cans so that labels faced out like good manners. I thought of the way labor moves through a day with no audience. That thought made the waiting easier. This was labor too, invisible but real. Jennifer returned near noon with a face that said the road had been laid straight so far. She said the bank officers had produced records that matched what we had traced. She said the surveillance footage from the branch had played well in the room. She said the panel had been quiet in a way that meant they were listening. She said Maria was steady. She said the phrase steady twice, as if steady had suddenly become a word large enough to stand on. We ate sandwiches out of paper wrappers and laughed when the mustard tried to escape. Patricia told me a story about the first time she had ever stepped into a courtroom as a clerk, how her knees had argued with her heels, and how the judge had winked as if to say, "We all begin somewhere." I told her about the time I had first flown a kite with Michael, how I had thought I knew wind, and how the string had taught me I did not. We traded those small stories back and forth until the door opened and an investigator asked for the originals from my folder. He signed a receipt with careful letters. I handed the pages over with the strange sorrow a man feels when he passes into another stage. I trusted that they would return. Just after 1, a twist I had not seen coming arrived at the door like a draft under a sill. Jennifer stepped back in with an expression that held both surprise and calculation. She said Sophia's counsel had contacted her office that morning with a request to proffer. She said counsel hinted that Sophia was prepared to discuss the creation of the so-called trust records and the labeling of transfers in exchange for consideration. Patricia did not move for a long 2 seconds. Then she asked the only question that mattered. Did counsel offer truth or leverage? Jennifer said he offered fear made to look like assistance. Nevertheless, the office would hear them. She added that this did not change our path today. The panel would receive the evidence already planned. "Consider this a weather report," she said. "Clouds are moving on the horizon. We will pack a coat and keep walking." I felt a heat I recognized as anger shift towards something harder to name. Pity was the wrong word. Clarity might be closer. The shape of their partnership was changing, but the pattern remained. When the ground shook, they looked for a body to stand on. If one grew soft, the other would climb. If one grew desperate, the other would become useful. I held my breath until that thought let go of my chest. The afternoon unfolded like a row of doors. Each opened with a particular hinge sound. The condo manager carried a list of payments and dates that drew a line from checks labeled as my care to a unit I had never set foot in. The internal emails printed and highlighted in Alan's steady hand taught the room a new dictionary. H support meant money I never saw. ST general meant vehicles and clothing. RB credit meant a line taken in my name and paid with company funds. The recordings played through small speakers filled the space with voices I knew too well. My son spoke of a trust that did not exist. My daughter-in-law softening her tone when a lie needed velvet. When the audio ended, the silence in the room felt like the pause after a prayer that had not asked for anything except light. Near 4, the marks on the clock seemed to thicken like wet paint. Jennifer came back one last time and said they were finished for the day. The panel would meet again tomorrow and likely vote soon after. She stressed again that nothing was guaranteed. Panels are made of people, she said, and people carry their own weather. But this was a sky you could read without guessing. On the drive home, Patricia did not ask me how I felt. She knew the question had too many answers. I stared at the streetlights coming on like small yeses across the city. The phone remained quiet in my pocket. When we reached my building, she told me to rest as if rest were a fruit I could pick. I promised to try at least to sit. That seemed honest. Upstairs, the apartment smelled like coffee that had fallen asleep on the counter. I rinsed the cup and stood at the sink a long time, letting the water run. The phone buzzed with a message from Margaret. She wrote that a friend had offered to put me up for a few days if I wanted space away from cameras. She said pride had no place in such an offer. It was practical. I thanked her and said I would decide in the morning. The thought of a quiet room that did not hold my history made me feel lighter. The thought of leaving my own small space made me feel smaller. Both could be true at once. There was a knock just before 9, soft and steady. I asked who it was without moving from the table. A voice answered with a name I had not heard outside a commercial. Michael's mentor, the one who had been photographed beside him at charity balls, the one whose grin had sold barrels of oil, and then the idea that he had moved beyond barrels. He said he would like a word. I opened the door to the chain. He stood with a posture learned in rooms that train men to claim space. He told me he had come as a friend to my family. He said he had heard whispers that things were getting out of hand. He said if I would sign a short statement acknowledging that I had misremembered the arrangement, investors could breathe again. He said he had been a son once too, and that eggs break when thrown. I told him eggs also feed people when cracked on purpose. He did not laugh. He placed a folded paper against the chain and asked me to consider it overnight. I slid it back. I said this door would not be opened by pressure. He inclined his head with a politician's grace and left without looking back. The hallway smelled of expensive aftershave for a long 5 minutes afterward. I called Patricia and told her who had come. She listened and let her breath sit where her words would go. She said this meant the circle around Michael had begun to shrink. She said some who had stood would start to sit. Others will run for the exits. None of that changes what we do tomorrow. We keep our voice low and our steps clean. I slept a little, woke, slept again. In a dream, I stood in a field with the wind from 2 directions at once. The kite line hummed in my hand, and for a moment I could not tell whether I was holding or the wind was holding me. When I woke, I found my fingers curved as if they knew a string even without one. The second day of testimony went faster. The forensic accountant returned with a chart that walked the panel through transfers like a map of a river and its branches. There were small bends where names changed. There were forks where money split without ever touching the shore of my life. The bank compliance officer explained their processes. One juror asked about the forgery. The officer answered without art. The signature on file did not match the one on the transfer. The footage did not show me entering the building. The notary stamp belonged to a contractor recently terminated. Facts lie down with the tired dignity of people who have carried heavy boxes. Just before lunch, Jennifer stepped into our waiting room with that mix of solemnity and relief a nurse wears on the day a patient leaves the ward. She said the panel had returned bills on all major counts: elder financial abuse, tax fraud, forgery, conspiracy. She said sealed for now, but not for long. She said we would not speak to reporters yet. She said the work had only changed shape. It had not ended. She reached for my hand and I let her hold it. It felt like a clasp made between people who had built a bridge and then watched others cross. On the sidewalk outside the building, the winter sun made the air look cleaner than it was. Patricia suggested we walk a few blocks before getting in the car. We did, passing a storefront that sold suits I could not afford and a bakery that smelled like butter even from the curb. She bought me a roll without asking and handed it to me like a sentence she did not want to say out loud. Eat. I did, and the simple salt and heat made my knees feel less like paper. We turned the corner and ran into Alan. He had chosen the corner well. He stood as if waiting for a bus, but his eyes searched my face for weather. I nodded once and he nodded back. He told me the office had begun to whisper resignation around Michael's name. He said a man who had bragged about never being surprised had finally met surprise. He said he had printed everything he should and nothing he should not. He told me that whatever came next, he had a new job lined up. I told him he had done more than enough. He said no, he had simply done the part that fell to his feet. Back at the apartment, I found a stack of envelopes inside the door. Some carried a reporter's letterhead. One was from the bank I had used the day I first opened an account in my own name years ago after closing a joint one with a woman long since gone. That bank offered a courtesy call. They wrote that they had updated my security protocol and would flag any attempt to open accounts with my name without me present. The letter felt like a small apology from a system that had not been designed for people like me. I made tea and stared at the steam just long enough to see something in it that looked like an answer. This part of the journey was not about explosive joy. It was about the quiet restoration of edges that had been sanded off by years of pretending. The world had not become kind overnight. It had become honest in a few rooms. That was a beginning. As evening fell, the reporter who had written the library piece called. She said off the record that she had learned Sophia had met with prosecutors. She said it was not clear whether she would be helpful or simply try to shift weight. She asked me what it felt like to have a story move beyond your control. I told her it felt like watching a river swell after a storm. You are grateful for the water and afraid of what it will take with it. She thanked me and said that line would live in her notebook even if it did not make the paper. Just before sleep, another message lit up my phone. A name I did not know. A man from Fort Worth. He wrote that he had given money to a woman named Sophie years ago and had hidden that shame under a coat made of jokes. He wrote that he would speak to Jennifer tomorrow. He wrote that my steady voice had put a hook in his mouth and pulled him toward air. I read the message twice and then a third time, not for praise, but to feel the shape of courage move across a screen from a stranger's hand. I closed my eyes and let the room dim around me. I whispered a line I had written weeks before without knowing where it would land. The doors are open now. Let the light do its work. Then I added a new line that tasted like resolve. I will keep the door from swinging shut. Morning would bring cameras and headlines and perhaps another visit from a man in a fine suit. Morning would bring paperwork and sworn statements and the next list of questions. Morning would bring a city that did not know my name and did not need to, and those few who now did and would remember where they had placed their hands when the room went quiet. I poured water for tomorrow's coffee and set the cup where I could find it by feel. Then I turned out the light and slept like a man who had finally put his weight on a floor built to hold him. The morning the trial finally began, the street outside the courthouse looked like a stage built overnight. News vans lined the curb. A white tent covered the sidewalk to shelter cameras from a sky that could not decide whether to clear or to threaten rain. People moved with that quick, careful energy you see when everyone knows they are entering a room that will keep a record of their steps. I held my folder under one arm, even though the originals sat locked in a cabinet in Jennifer's office. Habit is a kind of faith. I still needed the weight. Patricia met me at the corner and walked me through the side entrance. Her hand rested against my elbow just enough to remind me that I was not alone. She told me to breathe with the door. In the open, out on the close. I tried it once and felt ridiculous. I tried it again and felt better. Inside the courtroom, the air had the stillness of a church before the choir sings. The seal on the wall watched with a stern face. A row of benches held strangers and a few people whose faces had visited me in articles and dreams. Margaret sat near the aisle with a notebook in her lap, as if attending a lecture she needed to carry into rooms later. Janet had taken the morning off and sat 2 rows back, red frames bright as a small flag. Maria had a seat close to the aisle in case she was called quickly. Alan sat on the far side where he could see both me and the counsel tables. He nodded when our eyes met, and then looked down at his shoes like a man reminding his feet that the ground was solid. Michael entered a few minutes later in a suit that fit like it had been whispered into place. His jaw was tight. His eyes scanned the room with a soldier's triangle. Front, side, side. I felt an old ache try to lift its head, and I pressed my palm against my forehead until the ache sank again. Then Sophia walked in with her counsel. She had lost something that did not show on a scale. Her posture still knew its performance, but her eyes had learned a new math. Count what is left. Count what is gone. The judge took the bench, and the room rose as if the floor itself had moved. Jennifer and her team arranged their binders with quiet precision. The defense counsel did what good defense counsel do. They looked calm because their work required it. They made every motion as if they had been born in that room. The clerk read the case caption and the list of charges without drama. Elder financial abuse, tax fraud, forgery, conspiracy. Words that had once sounded like accusations now sounded like doors that had already opened. Jury selection had taken 2 full days earlier in the week. 12 people and 2 alternates now sat with expressions that kept everything inside. I tried not to measure them beyond their stillness. It was not my job to place my hope on their faces. My job was to speak when asked, and to hold the line when silence served the truth better than speech did. The opening statements began, and the room shifted from quiet to attention. Jennifer spoke first. She did not raise her voice. She told the jury they would see paper and hear recordings and watch the path of money as it moved through accounts like water through a well-planned set of channels. She told them the story would be about family, but the verdict would be about law. She used the word dignity when she spoke of elders, and I felt my throat tighten. She ended by saying the evidence would show that the defendants had used a parent's name as a tool, and then used that tool to pry open accounts that did not belong to them. Michael's counsel spoke next. He told the jury they would learn that families have complex arrangements. He told them business owners depend on advisors, and that mistakes can look like crimes when taken out of context. He told them they would see a father who had misremembered and a son who had tried to do right in a complicated world. He did not use the word love, but he used words that were hoped to sound like it. Sophia's counsel stood last and traveled a narrow road. He said his client had handled errands and tasks at her husband's request. He said she had relied on professionals. He said she had been dragged into a fight between father and son. He said the government had drawn a target around a marriage because the father had become loud. The first witnesses taught the jury how to read documents. A banker explained signatures and stamps and the process for approving transfers. The surveillance footage from the branch where my false signature had been used played on a small screen rolled to the front. The video did not show me. It showed Sophia walking out with a folder. It showed a man who did not work for that branch using a stamp later found to be faulty. The jury did not change expression, but a few of them leaned a quarter-inch forward. Attention works like gravity. It moves without sound. The forensic accountant followed and laid down charts that made mathematics feel like a language even people who avoided math could understand. Money left Michael's business accounts and entered a personal account. From there, it traveled to the condo holding company we had already named. From there, it traveled to vendors and to cash withdrawals timed to match the mythical allowance. Every line had a date. Every date had a document. Every document had a signature that either existed in reality or arrived from a crooked hand that did not know how I lifted my pen on the last letter of my name. Midday brought a break. The hallway outside the courtroom felt like a tunnel that wanted to hold whispers more than footsteps. Margaret handed me a small bag of almonds like a conspirator passing a secret. Janet squeezed my forearm and said one word that was worth a speech. Proud. I wanted to say, do not be. I am only doing what any person should. Instead, I said thank you because refusing a gift does not make the world more honest. Back in the room, the prosecution called Maria. She walked to the stand with the walk of a woman who has practiced courage in an empty kitchen and then decided to bring it out into the street. She took the oath and held her hands still in her lap. Jennifer asked her to describe what she had seen. Maria spoke of checks written monthly to S. Torres of invoices routed through the holding company of the afternoon I had sat in the office, and the text she had sent to warn me that Sophia was near. The defense tried to rattle her by asking about her job security and her feelings toward Sophia. Maria kept her voice level. She said she needed her job and she had told the truth. She said necessity did not make the truth smaller. Alan followed. He described the emails he had printed and how he had found them without breaking the law. He described his departure from the company and why he had decided to help. The defense attempted to paint him as a disgruntled former employee. He did not fight the label. He said he was disgruntled by theft and by the use of a father to hide it. He looked calm in a way that made his words heavier. Then came a twist that opened a different door. Sophia had agreed to testify. Her counsel led her through a gentle garden of questions about errands and obligations and the pressure of public life. Then Jennifer stood and the garden closed. She asked where the idea for the HB Trust had begun. Sophia swallowed and said it had come up in conversation with the accountant. Jennifer asked whether the spreadsheet titled HB Support had been created to mirror reality or to manufacture it. Sophia stared at the table and said, "We thought it would help with planning." Jennifer pressed again. "Help who?" Sophia finally said the quiet part aloud. "It helped us." Her voice was barely more than breath. The jury watched her without blinking. Jennifer asked about the surveillance footage. She asked about the bank branch. She asked who had brought the wrong notary stamp into the room. Sophia named a contractor who had since disappeared. Jennifer asked who had sent the text messages that used the phrase, "Your dad is finally useful." Sophia admitted the messages were hers. She said she had been angry that day. She said she had not meant harm. She said the words did not reflect her heart. The words reflected the record instead. When I took the stand, the room seemed to exhale and then hold its breath again. Patricia had practiced with me for hours to make sure my sentences walked on their own feet. Jennifer asked me to begin with my work. I described the warehouse floors and the hum of lights and the way a mop builds a rhythm when the body is tired but steady. I described the grocery shelves and the quiet math of facing labels. I described the way a man learns to live inside a small space when he understands he is not entitled to the big ones. Then I described the night of the party and the sentence about $8,000 each month. I described the cold taste of that lie in my mouth and the warm weight of my son's arm on my shoulder and the colder weight of my silence. Jennifer walked me through the months that followed. The research, the checks, the letter that turned me into a tax device, the crude threats, the lunch at the club where the phrase RB Care slid across the table like a coaster pretending to be a glass, the day the door knocked and search teams walked into homes I had once entered as a guest, the morning my son leaned his forehead against my door and asked me to lie for him. The jury did not shift. They did not have to. My own voice told me where the shifts were. Then the defense stood and tried to fold me into a different shape. They asked if I had ever accepted money from my son. I said yes on holidays and birthdays. They asked whether I held resentment. I said I held facts. They asked whether I might be confusing details. I said my memory could forget where I parked in a busy lot, but it did not invent bank statements or signatures. They asked whether I wanted my son in prison. I said I wanted truth to have a room in this city and for people to stop using love as a mask for theft. Silence followed, and then the judge called for a break because even truth needs water. Closing arguments arrived at last, like the last pages of a long book you do not want to end and need to end. Jennifer reminded the jury that the case was not about bitterness, but about a pattern of deception. She pointed at exhibits without looking away from the jurors. She said a person can claim care in a room full of applause. The bank will still tell you the truth. Michael's counsel spoke of confusion and of advice gone wrong. He tried to strip intent from action and leave the skeleton of a mistake. Sophia's counsel aimed for a small island and asked that she be seen as a follower who found herself ankle-deep in a sea that rose too fast. The judge instructed the jury. The jury left. Waiting for a verdict has a texture. It feels like sitting at the edge of a lake just before the wind changes. You do not know whether the surface will stay glass or begin to shiver. Hours passed. We tried to read the faces of clerks who had learned to be unreadable. I stood again. Patricia reminded me to breathe with the door. In the open. Out on the close. I did, and it helped. When the buzzer sounded, we filed back in. The jury took their seats with faces that told nothing. The clerk stood and asked the foreperson for the verdicts. Guilty of elder financial abuse, guilty on forgery, guilty on tax fraud, guilty on conspiracy. Each word landed like a chair finding the floor. My body felt both heavier and lighter, heavier with the weight of years named out loud, lighter with the knowledge that I had not imagined any of it. Michael stared straight ahead. He did not look at me. Sophia held a tissue in a hand that did not shake. The judge thanked the jury and set dates for sentencing. The room began to rustle into motion. Reporters shifted. Bags unzipped. People stood who had forgotten their legs were part of the day. Jennifer turned and put one hand flat on the table as if to steady it, or herself or me. Patricia squeezed my shoulder once and let go. Outside, the press waited like weather. Patricia stepped in front of me and spoke. She thanked the jury and the court staff. She said the case was about the dignity of elders and the integrity of records. She said we would have more to say after sentencing. Then she guided me past the microphones with the practiced skill of someone who has ferried many people across many rivers. When the doors of the car shut, the world went quiet enough to hear my own breath again. I leaned my head back and let my eyes close for a count of 10. Then I asked Patricia the question that had lived under all the others. "What happens now?" she said. "Now we ask for restitution. Now we attend the sentencing. Now we help the other victims who have come forward. Now we keep telling the truth in rooms that do not belong to us until they do." Sentencing arrived weeks later in a courtroom that felt smaller than before. The judge spoke at length about harm and about choices and about trust. He sentenced Michael to a term that would fit inside the shape of 18 years. He sentenced Sophia to a longer term because the evidence showed planning and pressure and the use of others as tools. Their attorneys filed the papers that attorneys file. The process moved forward with the slow dignity of a machine that had been built over generations. Afterward, I stood on the courthouse steps and faced the cameras because hiding no longer served anyone. I said I had loved my son, and that love had nothing to do with this verdict. I said I wanted every person listening to check the paper behind the stories they had been told. I said a name used without consent is not love. I thanked Maria and Alan and Jennifer and Patricia and the people whose names would never appear on a screen. Then I walked away without answering the questions that tried to make a simple story louder than it needed to be. The civil case settled later that spring. The amount mattered because money buys rent and heat and a car that starts when winter wants to keep you home. The amount mattered less than the letter that came with it, an apology from a firm, not a personal note from a son. Institutions can say sorry in ways people cannot. I allowed that letter to sit on my table for a day before filing it with the other papers that had once lived like wild animals and now lived in sleeves. I moved to a small place with more light and a view of a slice of downtown that glowed at night like a hallway found in a dream. I kept the old Ford for a while out of habit and then traded it for a car that did not carry a cough inside its engine. I left the warehouse job first, then the grocery. I stayed on the night shift cleaning for a few months longer because the simple act of making a floor shine felt like a prayer I did not want to end without a proper amen. On my last night, I walked the length of the building with a bucket and a quiet heart. I said thank you to the corners and the stairs and the sink and to the old mop that had learned my hand. In the months that followed, I began to speak in rooms I had never visited before. Senior centers, church basements, bank conference rooms where the coffee tasted of effort and the cookies had been arranged by someone who cared about the angles. I told the story without names when names would distract. I told it with names when names mattered. I taught people how to keep a notebook that could stand up in court and in the kitchen. I taught them to take photos with dates and to ask for paper older than a week. I told them not to fear asking for help and not to confuse quiet with peace. The reporter from the library piece asked me to write a column once a month. I agreed with one condition. Each piece would end not with my voice but with a sentence from someone who had written to me. We wanted readers to hear the chorus. Over time, those voices filled the page with an honor roll of ordinary courage. A retired teacher who found the strength to confront a son. A widower who discovered a daughter-in-law had redirected his pension and then redirected his life. A neighbor who noticed a pattern and made a call. We gave them room and they grew. Sophia wrote to me once from prison. The letter arrived scented with a faint perfume that made me laugh and then made me sad. She said she was working with a counselor. She said she understood now what she had done. She asked if I could forgive her. I wrote back and said forgiveness was not a switch. It was a field. Some days you can cross it. Some days you can only stand at the fence and look. I said I hoped she would build something true where she was. I did not write to Michael. He did not write to me. That was a different field. I visited it in my mind sometimes, and then I left it alone. The first winter after the verdict, I held a small gathering in a community room that smelled like soup and old wood. Maria spoke about courage that knows the price of rent. Alan spoke about duty inside a company that had lost its way. Janet brought red paper cups and poured coffee with the calm of a nurse. Margaret stepped to the front and said the one sentence I now carry like a piece of luck. We are responsible for the rooms we applaud in. The people who came that night brought stories that did not need microphones. We listened and then we clapped not to celebrate pain, but to honor the work people had done to climb out of it. Sometimes people ask me what I would say if Michael stood at my door again. I tell them the truth. I do not know. On some days I would open the door and ask him to sit, and we would let the silence do its work. On other days I would speak through wood for both our sakes. Love does not cancel consequences. Consequences do not erase love. I live with both like a man who has learned to hold two tools at once without dropping either. Last week I sat in the park on a cold morning and watched a girl teach her grandfather how to use the camera on a phone. He laughed when his own face filled the screen and she laughed at his laugh. I felt a small ache and a larger gratitude. A life can be broken in places and still contain plenty of room for light. If you have listened this far, you already know the shape of what I am asking. If you suspect someone is using your name for their convenience, ask for paper. If a person performs care for a crowd, ask how and where and when the care touches your actual life. If shame is the only thing standing between you and the truth, set it down. Shame is a poor guard. Fear is worse. Bring someone with a notebook. Bring someone with a steady voice. Breathe with the door. In the open. Out on the close. I am 59 now. The suit I wear belongs to me, and the sleeves are the right length. The collar leaves room for a man to breathe. When I walk into rooms that once turned me into a prop, I carry my name in the front of my chest like good bread. I shake hands, and I sit, and I listen, and sometimes I stand. I tell the story the way labor tells it, without smoke, without mirrors, with the kind of clarity you can eat. Before I end this chapter, I want to say the names that held me up when the room tilted. Patricia with her hands on the law and her eye on my breath. Jennifer with her quiet insistence that facts have muscles when trained well. Mariah, who signed her name and went to work the next day because courage pays bills too. Alan, who printed only what the day required and then slept with a cleaner heart. Janet, who faced labels and faces with equal care. Margaret learned that applause is a responsibility and not a hobby. The reporter who wrote my words inside a paper where people who needed them would find them. The strangers who sent emails that made my kitchen feel like a choir loft. If you were in that group and we have not met, know that I have said your name in my home with gratitude, even if I do not know how to spell it. The last page of my notebook from those months lives in a frame above my desk. It holds one line I wrote the night before the grand jury voted. The doors are open now. Let the light do its work. I have added a small line to the bottom in a steadier hand. Keep the door from swinging shut. That is the work we do together. That is the work I will do as long as my breath can keep a rhythm. That is the work I ask you to help with by paying attention to the small math of your own life and the lives of those you love. If you ever find yourself in a room where a toast turns your name into a costume, remember this. You do not have to wear it. You can step into the light without asking permission. You can speak plainly until the sound reaches the person in the last row who needed the word that day. You can be the one to set the record straight, and in doing so, you might set a record that others can follow. This is not revenge dressed as justice. This is justice learning to walk without applause. This is a man who learned how to lift a mop and now lifts a voice. This is the end of one story and the start of 1,000 others that will not need my name to make sense. If you are carrying a folder in your hands right now, make sure it holds more than paper. Make sure it holds your name. And when the time comes, place that name in the room where it belongs. Then breathe with the door and let the light in. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the playlist now showing on screen.